Under the soft glow of Mumbai's late-night street lamps, the city hums with life even as the hour slips toward dawn. The sounds are quieter now, softened into the rhythm of sleep, the rickshaw engines fading into the distance, the cries of vendors long silenced, the Arabian Sea murmuring at the edges of the city. Yet in the alleys of Dongri, in the neighborhoods where shadows gather and whispers travel faster than footsteps, there is still one name that floats like smoke through the night. Dawood Ibrahim. A name both feared and revered, spoken softly, as though the syllables themselves carried danger. He is not here, not on these streets anymore, but somehow, his presence lingers. It hangs in the air like the perfume of the past, impossible to wash away. Legends often begin with exaggerations, and over time they turn into myths, but Dawood's story refuses to fade. It is as if he has become two people at once, the man of flesh and blood who rose from the crowded chawls of Mumbai, and the phantom who continues to haunt the corridors of power, the underworld, and even the dreams of those who grew up in his shadow. For more than 4 decades, his name has been tied to smuggling, extortion, Bollywood scandals, cricket match fixing, and even global terrorism. And yet, in the quiet of the night, he also becomes something else, a bedtime story, passed between generations, where parents tell children about the ghost Don who once ruled Mumbai like an emperor without a crown. Imagine yourself walking down the narrow lanes of Dongri in the 1960s, when the city was still called Bombay. The air is thick with the smell of spices from cramped kitchens, mingled with the salty sea breeze drifting inland. Children play cricket under dim yellow bulbs, their laughter echoing through the narrow gullies. Amid them runs a boy, thin but sharp-eyed, the son of a humble constable. He listens carefully, observes everything, the fights between street gangs, the illicit deals whispered outside shops, the struggles of ordinary families trying to survive. That boy would grow into a man who learned not only how to survive but how to dominate. And eventually, how to vanish so completely that his absence became more powerful than his presence. Every great underworld saga begins with contradiction. On one hand, Dawood was a son, a brother, a boy who once went to school like countless others. On the other, he would become the architect of an empire built on smuggling, intimidation, and ruthless control. His story is not a simple tale of good and evil. Instead, it is woven from the fabric of poverty, opportunity, betrayal, and ambition. To understand Dawood is to understand a Mumbai caught between two identities, one city waking to modernity, skyscrapers, and film stars, another city crumbling under crime, corruption, and the rule of gangsters. It is in this contradiction that Dawood found his opening, and it is from this soil that the legend of the Ghost Don grew. As we begin this journey into his world, let us slow the pace and breathe in the atmosphere of the times. In the 1970s, Mumbai was already alive with crime syndicates. The docks were brimming with smuggled goods, gold biscuits tucked away in secret compartments, foreign electronics wrapped in cloth and passed through trusted hands. At the same time, movie posters decorated the walls, promising glamour and escape. For the ordinary citizen, life was hard, but the dream of something bigger was always close enough to touch. This was the environment in which Dawood would rise, a city of contradictions, offering both temptation and struggle in equal measure. But even as we look back, one question lingers: where is Dawood now? The man himself has not been seen publicly for years. Rumors place him in Dubai, in Karachi, or moving silently between safe houses under heavy guard. Some say he still pulls strings in international crime, others insist his empire has crumbled, leaving him only with memories and fear. Yet the mystery is perhaps more powerful than the truth. For in Mumbai's collective imagination, Dawood never left. His name surfaces whenever a story of crime, smuggling, or betrayal comes alive. His shadow stretches long, covering even those who never saw his face. As the city sleeps, the ghost Don stirs in memory. His story is not told in loud headlines alone, but in the quiet details, the way people still lower their voices when mentioning him, the way Bollywood films draw inspiration from his life without daring to name him directly, the way law enforcement officers still dream of the day he might be brought back to stand trial. Dawood's tale is not one that ends with prison bars or a simple obituary. Instead, it lives on, growing larger in the retelling, like a river that continues to flow even after its source has been forgotten. Tonight, as we unravel the chapters of his life, we will move slowly, calmly, tracing his journey from the narrow lanes of Dongri to the glittering skyscrapers of Dubai, and finally into the misty silence of exile. We will follow his footsteps not in haste but with patience, lingering in the corners where shadows deepen, listening to the echoes of deals made in secrecy and loyalties broken in blood. Each chapter will reveal another face of Dawood, the boy, the Don, the exile, and finally the ghost. And so the story begins. A whisper in the dark, a name that refuses to die. Dawood Ibrahim, the man who rose from nothing, who became everything, and who remains, even now, the ghost who haunts Mumbai's underworld. His is a tale of power and paranoia, of loyalty and betrayal, of wealth beyond measure and loneliness beyond comprehension. It is the kind of story that lingers in the mind long after the city sleeps, haunting the quiet hours like the faint rustle of footsteps in an empty alley. Dongri in the 1950s was not the polished, crowded commercial center many see today. It was a world of contrasts, narrow, winding lanes lined with old chawls, small mosques tucked between tea stalls, and busy marketplaces where traders shouted prices above the clamor of bicycles and bullock carts. The air was always thick with smells, frying samosas, spiced curries, and the briny breeze that rolled in from the Arabian Sea. By day, children played cricket with makeshift bats carved from wood, and by night, the same streets transformed into corridors where men whispered about deals, debts, and dangerous favors. In this neighborhood, life was lived openly and secretly at the same time. It was here that Dawood Ibrahim first opened his eyes. Born in 1955, Dawood was one of 12 children in a modest Muslim family. His father, Ibrahim Kaskar, worked as a head constable in the Mumbai police. This simple fact added a strange irony to Dawood's life story. The boy who would one day be named India's most wanted criminal grew up under the roof of a man sworn to uphold the law. His father was a disciplined, hard-working man, known for his strictness, while his mother, Amina, offered warmth and care, keeping the household steady amid the noise of such a large family. Dawood was not born into wealth or influence. His childhood was one of small rooms, shared meals, and the constant need to stretch every rupee. And yet, Dongri was never just an ordinary place to grow up. It had a rhythm of its own, a rhythm that shaped the minds of its children. Stories of local gangsters and smugglers traveled quickly through these alleys, carried on hushed voices like legends. For boys, the lure of those stories was powerful. Men who had once been nothing now moved through the streets with gold watches, fast cars, and pockets lined with cash. For a child like Dawood, who saw his father working long hours for little pay, these tales of sudden wealth must have glimmered like forbidden stars. Poverty could teach patience, but Dongri taught something else, the possibility of shortcuts. Teachers at Dawood's local school often described him as bright but restless. He was clever enough to grasp lessons quickly, but he lacked the patience to sit still and follow rules. Friends from those days recall him as sharp-eyed, with a quiet confidence that drew others to him. Even in childhood, he seemed to carry an aura that was bigger than his age. He was not the tallest or the strongest boy, but he had a presence, the kind of presence that made others listen when he spoke. Small fights and schoolyard disputes often ended with Dawood stepping in, not always with fists, but with words that seemed to persuade or intimidate, depending on the moment. But Dongri was not only a schoolyard. Beyond the classrooms, the docks loomed large, bringing in ships from the Gulf. With them came goods that were scarce in India at the time: gold, watches, fabrics, electronics. Smuggling was not just a crime, it was an industry, and for many families, it was survival. Young Dawood often wandered near the docks, watching men unload crates in the shadows, his imagination feeding on the danger and allure of it all. He may not have understood the full scale of these operations then, but the seeds of curiosity had been planted. In a city where opportunity was scarce, this underground economy whispered a different kind of promise. At home, his father tried to shield him from the influence of the streets. Ibrahim Kasker was a man who valued honesty and discipline, and he hoped his children would follow paths of respectability. But Dongri's streets were relentless teachers, and Dawood was a student who listened. Older boys, already part of local gangs, noticed his daring spirit. They teased him, tested him, and eventually let him run small errands. Carrying messages, keeping watch, or even participating in petty thefts, these were the first steps on a path that would lead far beyond Dongri. For a boy who craved adventure, it was both thrilling and dangerous. He was learning how to navigate two worlds, the world of discipline his father demanded, and the world of power the streets offered. One can imagine Dawood lying awake at night in the cramped family home, listening to the muffled conversations of his parents, the sounds of his siblings breathing in their sleep, and outside, the distant voices of men who lived by their own rules. To a young boy, those voices carried not only mystery but a sense of destiny. Perhaps he felt torn between pleasing his father and chasing the freedom he saw others seize so boldly. Or perhaps, even then, he had already made up his mind. For in every city's story, there are those who choose the straight path, and those who take the crooked one. Dawood seemed destined for the latter. Childhood in Dongri was not gentle, but it was formative. It gave Dawood both the grit of survival and the dream of escape. He was a product of narrow streets and broad ambitions, of family discipline and street temptation. He learned early how to read people, how to win loyalty, and how to bend rules. These were skills that would stay with him long after he left his father's modest home behind. In those formative years, Dawood Ibrahim was not yet a don, not yet a fugitive, not yet a ghost. He was simply a boy standing at the crossroads of ordinary life and extraordinary crime, watching the streets carefully, waiting for his chance. Looking back now, it seems almost inevitable that this child of Dongri, caught between the shadow of his father's police uniform and the glitter of smuggler's gold, would grow into a man who straddled two worlds. The neighborhood itself, with its smells, its sounds, its secrets, shaped him as much as any decision he ever made. And though the boy Dawood left Dongri behind decades ago, the ghost of that childhood still lingers in those lanes. Residents still speak of him, sometimes with pride, sometimes with fear, but always with a sense that they once witnessed the beginning of a legend. The streets of Dongri were always alive with noise, but for a restless teenager like Dawood Ibrahim, the sounds were more than background. They were signals, the scrape of shutters closing on shops, the rumble of carts loaded with contraband, the sudden hush when a local gangster walked past. By the late 1960s, Dawood was no longer just a boy watching from the sidelines. He was stepping into the current of the underworld, and once he entered, there would be no turning back. At first, it was innocent enough, or at least it seemed so. Dawood ran errands for older boys who already had connections with the dockside gangs. He carried packages, passed along messages, kept an eye out for police patrols. To him, these jobs felt like initiation rites, tests of loyalty and nerve. What might have seemed risky to others filled him with a strange thrill. Each successful errand gave him a reputation. Here was a boy who could be trusted, who didn't scare easily, who carried himself with a quiet authority unusual for his age. The underworld of Bombay at that time was fractured. On one side were the Pathan gangs led by Karim Lala, with their roots deep in extortion and gambling. On the other side were smugglers like Haji Mastana, who turned the docks into pipelines for gold and luxury goods. There were dozens of smaller players too, each holding sway over a handful of streets. For a teenager trying to find his place, it was a dangerous maze to step into. But Dawood had already shown a gift for navigating danger. He didn't just copy what others did, he observed, he analyzed, and he adapted. Petty thefts soon became the next stage. Dawood and a small band of friends began picking pockets at crowded markets, slipping into locked shops, and sometimes waylaying unsuspecting travelers late at night. They were not yet feared, but they were noticed. The police, especially in his father's circle, began to hear whispers about the young constable's son running with the wrong crowd. The irony was bitter, the child of the lawman was drifting toward crime. His father, Ibrahim Kasker, tried to discipline him, scolded him, and even punished him, but by then the streets had already claimed Dawood's imagination. One of Dawood's first brushes with the law came during these years. Caught for theft, he was briefly detained, an event that should have served as a warning. Instead, it hardened him. The experience of being inside a police station, facing questioning, gave him an early glimpse into both the strength and the weaknesses of the system. He realized that fear was temporary, that influence and money could smooth over almost anything. It was a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. The system was not unbreakable, and he could learn to bend it. Around this time, Dawood's charisma began to set him apart. He wasn't the biggest fighter in his gang, but he had a sharp tongue and a natural authority. When disputes arose between his friends, it was often Dawood who settled them. He understood instinctively that power was not just about fists, it was about loyalty, respect, and creating the feeling that following him would lead to something greater. Slowly, the boys around him stopped being just his friends, they became his crew, his early foundation for what would one day be called D Company. As the teenage gang grew bolder, their clashes with rival groups became more frequent. Street corners were valuable, not just for pride but for the flow of money from protection rackets and petty extortion. Dawood's group clashed often with Pathan youths, leading to bloody fights fought with knives and sticks. These encounters taught Dawood two lessons: first, that survival required strategy as much as courage, and second, that enemies were everywhere, waiting for the slightest weakness. In these fights, Dawood began to cultivate the cautious paranoia that would later define his leadership style. At the same time, he also saw opportunities to rise. Older dons were focused on maintaining their empires, often growing complacent. Dawood sensed that a new generation was hungry, willing to take risks the older men avoided. He wanted more than scraps, he wanted the city itself. His petty crimes were no longer just for thrill or survival, they were practice, each one a stepping stone towards something larger. The docks of Bombay provided the perfect training ground. Smuggling was booming, and Dawood began working more closely with networks moving goods from Dubai. Here, he saw real money for the first time, stacks of cash passing through sweaty palms, gold bars hidden in double walls of cargo crates, luxury watches that gleamed in the night. Compared to this wealth, petty theft seemed small. Dawood was learning the difference between being a street thug and being a businessman in the shadows. He began to dream bigger, seeing himself not as a follower but as a leader who could one day control the flow of smuggling across the city. Yet the road was dangerous. Police raids were frequent, and rival gangs always waited for weakness. More than once, Dawood narrowly escaped capture. These close calls added to his mystique among his peers. He was becoming a figure who seemed untouchable, someone who could slip through trouble with uncanny luck. For the young men who followed him, this aura made him irresistible. At home, however, the tension grew. His father's disappointment deepened, and arguments became frequent. To his family, Dawood was drifting further from the path of respectability. But the boy had already chosen. He had tasted the thrill of power, the first taste of money, and the intoxicating loyalty of followers. Going back to ordinary life was no longer possible. By the end of his teenage years, Dawood Ibrahim was no longer just another boy in Domri. He was a rising figure in the underworld, known in certain circles, feared in others, and admired by many young men who saw in him a chance to escape poverty. The first steps had been taken, and though they seemed small at the time, thefts, fights, smuggling errands, they were the foundation of a journey that would lead him from the gullies of Domri to the throne of Mumbai's underworld. And yet, with every step forward, the dangers multiplied. Enemies were watching. The police were becoming less forgiving. Rival gangs were sharpening their knives. Dawood was stepping onto a stage much larger than he could have imagined. What he did next would not only cement his place in the city's underworld but also mark the beginning of battles that would make him a legend. By the late 1970s, Bombay's underworld was simmering with tension. The old guard of gangsters still held sway, but a new generation of young men, sharper and hungrier, was knocking at the gates. Among them was Dawood Ibrahim, no longer a petty thief or an errand boy but a name whispered in the lanes of Domri. He had grown into a young man who carried himself with a mix of confidence and calculation, already showing the traits of a leader who thought beyond the next fight. Yet, to claim real power, Dawood first had to prove himself in the brutal contests that determined dominance over the city streets. Domri itself was a prize. Whoever controlled it had access to the docks, to smuggling routes, and to the tightly packed neighborhoods where protection money flowed like a steady river. But Domri was not unguarded. The Pathan gangs, led by Karim Lala, had deep roots here. Tall, broad-shouldered men who had come to Bombay from Afghanistan years earlier, they were respected and feared in equal measure. Their code was simple: loyalty to the clan, respect for elders, and violence when challenged. For years, the Pathans dominated the gambling dens, the extortion rackets, and the informal courts where disputes were settled. Young men like Dawood were supposed to either serve them or stay out of their way. Dawood chose neither. The first real clash came not in a grand battle, but in something small, almost trivial. A dispute over extortion rights in one of Domri's busy markets escalated when Dawood's men refused to back down against the Pathans. Dawood could have walked away, he was still young, still untested against giants like Karim Lala's men. But retreat was not in his nature. He saw in this confrontation a chance to show that the old order could be challenged. When the fight broke out, knives flashed under the dim glow of street lamps, and fists crashed against bone. Dawood was in the thick of it, not just fighting but directing, urging his boys forward with sharp commands. Though the Pathans were stronger, the fearlessness of Dawood's group stunned them. It was the first time the balance of power seemed to shift, however slightly, in Domri. That skirmish set off a chain reaction. The Pathans could not ignore the insult, and Dawood could not afford to lose face. Over the months that followed, Domri witnessed a series of violent confrontations, ambushes in alleys, running battles near the docks, and brutal reprisals on both sides. The police tried to intervene, but corruption and fear tied their hands. For ordinary residents, these were terrifying days. Mothers kept their children indoors, and shopkeepers paid protection money to whichever gang approached them first, never knowing which side would rule the street by nightfall. In this chaos, Dawood's reputation grew. What made him different was not just his courage but his strategy. While the Pathans relied on brute strength and intimidation, Dawood combined violence with cunning. He built networks, cultivated informants, and always stayed one step ahead of the police. When raids were planned, he seemed to know before the officers themselves. His men began to see him not just as a fighter but as someone who could outthink his enemies. Slowly, the idea of Dawood as a Don, not just another gangster, began to take shape. At the same time, Dawood displayed a kind of charisma that the older Dons lacked. He was young, stylish, and spoke with the confidence of someone who believed he was destined for more. Unlike the Pathans, who inspired fear through raw power, Dawood inspired loyalty through a vision. He promised his followers not just survival, but prosperity. He told them that they were not merely street thugs, but soldiers in a brotherhood that could one day control all of Bombay. To young men tired of being foot soldiers for older bosses, his words were magnetic. Still, the battles with the Pathans were far from over. One of the most notorious clashes happened near the Baikula railway station, where Dawood's men ambushed a rival crew in broad daylight. The boldness of the attack shocked the city. Newspapers carried stories of a new gang war spreading through Bombay, and police dossiers began to list Dawood Ibrahim as a dangerous emerging figure. For Dawood, the publicity was both a curse and a blessing. On one hand, he was now firmly in the crosshairs of law enforcement. On the other, the streets spoke his name with fear, and fear was power. As his gang tightened its grip on Domri, Dawood began to display another side of leadership: calculated generosity. He sometimes forgave debts, helped struggling shopkeepers, and offered protection to families caught in the crossfire. These gestures were not acts of kindness alone, they were strategic investments in reputation. People began to see him not just as a criminal, but as someone who could deliver justice, swift, brutal, but effective. In neighborhoods where police authority was weak, Dawood's word became law. The Pathans, however, were not so easily dethroned. Karim Lala remained a towering figure, respected by many and connected deeply within the city's underworld and beyond. Dawood understood that a direct confrontation with Lala himself would be reckless. Instead, he focused on chipping away at the Pathans' dominance, targeting lieutenants, undermining their businesses, and winning over the younger generation of gangsters who were eager for change. It was a long game, and Dawood had the patience to play it. For the people of Domri, these years were like living in the middle of a storm. At any moment, a quiet street could erupt into violence. Yet amid the uncertainty, a shift was happening. Where once Karim Lala's men walked with impunity, now they looked over their shoulders. Where once Dawood was just a boy running errands, now he was a young don in the making, a figure who seemed destined to rise higher than anyone had imagined. Looking back, these battles for Domri were more than territorial disputes. They were the crucible in which Dawood's identity was forged. He learned that survival was not enough, one had to dominate, to outthink, to inspire. He discovered that power was not only about controlling streets but about controlling stories, about becoming the name that lingered in every whisper, every fearful glance, every hushed conversation in the bazaars. By the end of this chapter of his life, Dawood Ibrahim was no longer a rising figure, he was a force to be reckoned with. The boy from Domri had become a challenger to the old order, carving out space for himself in a world that respected only strength and cunning. The path ahead was still fraught with danger, but the direction was set. From the battles of Domri, the legend of Dawood the Don was born. The rise of Dawood Ibrahim from a street fighter in Domri to a commanding figure in Bombay's underworld was not the result of solitary ambition alone. It was built on something more enduring, brotherhood. In the chaotic world of smuggling, extortion, and street wars, loyalty was currency, and betrayal was inevitable. Dawood knew that if he was to establish lasting power, he needed more than a crew of hired guns. He needed a family bound not by blood alone, but by an oath that went deeper than friendship. Out of this vision was born what the city would soon come to know as D Company, a name that would echo across continents. The earliest seeds of this empire were sown in the lanes of Domri. Dawood was not working alone, by his side were his brothers, Shabur and Anis, and a circle of trusted friends who had stood with him during the bloody clashes with the Pathans. Shabur, the elder brother, was Dawood's right hand in those days. He was fierce, impulsive, and unafraid of direct confrontation. If Dawood was the strategist who thought 10 moves ahead, Shabur was the warrior who carried out those plans with raw aggression. Together, they formed a dangerous balance, brain and muscle, patience and fire. Anis, younger and more reserved, often played the role of quiet organizer, keeping records, managing logistics, and ensuring the flow of money remained steady. It was this mix of personalities that gave the group its unique strength. But blood ties alone could not sustain an empire. Dawood began to attract men from the streets, boys who had grown up in poverty, watching the glamour of crime from the shadows. To them, Dawood represented more than just survival, he represented opportunity. Where society had rejected them, he offered them a brotherhood, a chance to belong to something larger than themselves. Initiation into Dawood's gang was not just about proving strength, it was about proving loyalty. Many were tested in small ways, delivering messages, collecting payments, keeping secrets. Those who passed earned Dawood's trust, and once you were inside his circle, leaving was not an option. The philosophy of D Company was clear, unity above all. Every member was expected to treat another like family. Betrayal was met with swift and merciless punishment, not just to the traitor but often to his entire kin, ensuring fear kept loyalty intact. At the same time, Dawood made sure that loyalty was rewarded. He shared wealth with his men, dressed them in sharp clothes, and allowed them to enjoy the lifestyle that Bombay's poor could only dream of. Expensive watches, foreign cigarettes, and flashy cars became symbols of belonging to this new brotherhood of shadows. For young men who had grown up with nothing, this was intoxicating. The name D Company itself was not born overnight. It was the police and the press that first coined the term to describe Dawood's growing network. What started as a loose group of gangsters slowly began to resemble an organization with hierarchy, discipline, and ambition. Dawood embraced the label, realizing that it gave his men an identity larger than their individual reputations. Soon, whispers of D Company spread beyond Dongri, into Baikola, Nagpada, and even the plush neighborhoods of South Bombay where smuggling deals were struck in the back rooms of restaurants. Unlike the older gangs, which often functioned like extended families or regional tribes, D Company was modern in its approach. Dawood ran it less like a gang and more like a corporation. He delegated roles, some men handled extortion rackets, others controlled gambling dens, while a few managed smuggling operations at the docks. Money flowed upward, but protection and status flowed downward. Everyone had a role, and everyone knew who their boss was. This corporate-style structure made D Company more resilient than the loose alliances of the past. What made Dawood's brotherhood even more formidable was his ability to blend brutality with charm. He could order a man's execution in the morning and attend a wedding in the evening, smiling and handing out gifts as though he were a benevolent patron. To the poor in Dongri, he became something of a Robin Hood, the Don who handed out money during festivals, who ensured widows were not harassed by landlords, who offered protection when the police turned a blind eye. This cultivated loyalty not just from his men, but from the community itself. A man who had the people behind him was harder to topple than a Don who ruled only through fear. At the same time, D Company was not limited to the slums. Dawood had a vision of expansion that set him apart. He built connections with smugglers at the docks who were bringing in gold, silver, electronics, and luxury goods into Bombay. These smuggled items, highly prized in a country with strict import controls, brought huge profits. By inserting himself into this lucrative trade, Dawood ensured that his gang's wealth far outstripped that of his rivals. The money wasn't just for show, it was reinvested into expanding operations, buying weapons, bribing officials, and recruiting more men. Slowly, Dawood began weaving a web of influence that extended beyond the underworld into the police, the bureaucracy, and even the political class. The rise of D Company also marked the beginning of a new style of underworld leadership. Where the Pathans and older Dons relied heavily on physical intimidation, Dawood relied on networks. He cultivated informants inside police stations, dockyards, and even rival gangs. He understood that information was as powerful as a gun, and he ensured he always had more of it than his enemies. His men operated with discipline, never drinking on duty, never leaving evidence behind, always ensuring that the gang's name carried an air of mystery and invincibility. For all its discipline, however, D Company was not without blood. Violence was its foundation. Dawood and Shabir made it clear that anyone who crossed them would face consequences. Several murders in Bombay during this period were attributed to Dawood's men, though direct evidence was scarce. Victims disappeared, rivals were gunned down in broad daylight, and fear spread through the city. The message was unmistakable: Dawood was not just another gangster, he was building something permanent, something unstoppable. By the early 1980s, the legend of D Company had taken firm root. Dawood Ibrahim was no longer a young man trying to prove himself in Dongri. He was now the architect of a syndicate, a shadow empire that combined the ferocity of the streets with the sophistication of organized crime. To the police, he was a growing menace; to the people of Dongri, he was a protector; to rival gangs, he was a storm that could not be ignored. And to his men, he was more than a boss, he was the head of a family, a brotherhood of shadows that would one day extend its reach far beyond the shores of Bombay. The 1980s in Bombay were years of transformation, for the city, for its underworld, and above all, for Dawood Ibrahim. The small-time street brawls of Dongri and the territorial wars with Pathan gangs were no longer enough to satisfy his ambition. By now, he had tasted power, wealth, and control, and he understood something vital: money was the true backbone of influence. Fear could silence people, but money could buy them. It could bend the law, silence witnesses, and even secure protection from those meant to enforce justice. And in the India of the 1980s, where strict import restrictions made foreign goods a luxury, there was one trade that promised more wealth than any other: smuggling. The Bombay docks at this time were a theater of shadows. Ships rolled in from the Middle East and Southeast Asia, carrying contraband hidden in containers, gold biscuits packed tightly in steel boxes, silver bricks disguised as industrial goods, and electronics that ordinary Indians could only dream of owning. The government's strict regulations made it nearly impossible for citizens to buy these items legally. A small television set from Japan, a packet of foreign cigarettes, or a VCR could fetch 10 times its cost in Bombay's grey markets. Into this hunger for the forbidden stepped Dawood Ibrahim, and he stepped in with vision, organization, and ruthless determination. Dawood's early smuggling ventures were small, often conducted through contacts on the docks who would look the other way for a price. But with the creation of D Company, the scale changed. He forged direct links with gold smugglers in Dubai and Sharjah, men who had long been funneling contraband into India but were always in need of reliable partners on the ground. Dawood was exactly that: reliable, ruthless, and connected. His men would ensure that shipments were unloaded smoothly, bribes delivered discreetly, and the goods distributed across the city's underground markets. Unlike older dons who focused purely on the violent side of the trade, Dawood treated smuggling like a business. He built networks across Bombay, from Crawford Market to Jhaveri Bazaar, from the lanes of Nagpada to the wealthy neighborhoods of South Bombay. Shopkeepers who wanted to stock foreign goods had to go through his men. Jewelers looking for untaxed gold to meet the city's insatiable demand for ornaments turned to D Company. Even ordinary citizens dreaming of a foreign wristwatch or a cassette player unknowingly funded Dawood's empire. His grip tightened not through brute force alone, but by embedding himself into the everyday desires of Bombay's people. But smuggling was never without danger. The customs officers at the docks were under pressure from the government to curb the illegal trade, and rival gangs also eyed the golden profits. Dawood's genius was in turning threats into opportunities. Many customs officers who might have stood in his way found themselves quietly on his payroll. Those who resisted faced intimidation or worse. Stories began to spread of officers who suddenly went silent after refusing bribes, or whose families were threatened until their loyalty shifted. Rival gangs that tried to interfere often found themselves ambushed, their leaders cut down in broad daylight. By blending bribery with violence, Dawood ensured that his smuggling network became nearly untouchable. One of the turning points in his smuggling empire came with the soaring price of gold in the 1980s. India's obsession with the precious metal was legendary, and Dawood capitalized on it with unmatched efficiency. Gold bars flowed from Dubai into Bombay, hidden in cargo shipments or carried by couriers known as carriers or mules. Many of these couriers were ordinary travelers, students, housewives, or small-time businessmen, who would be paid handsomely for carrying gold through airports. Dawood's men managed every detail, from arranging tickets to ensuring that customs officers were bribed ahead of time. The scale of operations grew so vast that, according to police estimates, a large portion of all smuggled gold entering India passed through Dawood's hands. Silver was another lucrative trade, though bulkier and harder to transport. D Company innovated by using fishing boats along the coast, moving shipments at night to avoid detection. Electronics, too, became a booming business: VCRs, cassette players, imported jeans, and perfumes. For the youth of Bombay in the 1980s, owning a foreign product was not just about utility, it was about status. And Dawood made sure that every such dream was tied, in some hidden way, to his empire. The money that poured in from these operations was staggering. Dawood didn't hoard it. He reinvested strategically, into real estate in Bombay and Dubai, into Bollywood financing, and into expanding his network abroad. His men were given comfortable lives, ensuring their loyalty never wavered. He funded lavish lifestyles not just for himself but also for his close associates, ensuring that his name was associated with glamour as much as with fear. Photographs from the time show him in sharp suits, gold chains glinting under his collar, surrounded by men who looked more like businessmen than gangsters. Of course, this rise did not go unnoticed. Law enforcement agencies grew increasingly aware of Dawood's expanding empire. The media, too, began to paint him as the new face of Bombay's underworld, replacing the fading Pathans and older Dons. Yet arrests were rare, and convictions even rarer. Whenever cases were filed, witnesses disappeared, evidence went missing, or officials suddenly lost interest. Dawood seemed untouchable, a man who moved in shadows so carefully that the law could never quite reach him. The smuggling empire was not just about wealth, it was also about influence. By controlling the flow of contraband, Dawood gained leverage over businessmen, politicians, and even celebrities. A jeweler in Jhaveri Bazaar who needed untaxed gold had to stay on his good side. A film producer who wanted funding for a new movie might accept money from his men, knowingly or unknowingly tying themselves to his network. This web of influence extended Dawood's reach beyond the criminal world into the very fabric of Bombay's society. And yet, for all his wealth and success, the smuggling trade brought with it blood. Rivalries intensified, and street shootouts became common. Dawood's men, though disciplined, were not saints, they enforced his will with violence whenever needed. Newspapers of the time began reporting an alarming rise in contract killings, many of which were whispered to be linked to D Company. Smuggling was profitable, but it was also dangerous, and every shipment carried with it the risk of betrayal, violence, or death. Still, through it all, Dawood emerged stronger. By the mid-1980s, he was no longer just a gangster from Dongri. He was an international smuggler, a businessman of shadows, and the undisputed leader of D Company. His empire spanned from the streets of Bombay to the glittering malls of Dubai, fueled by gold, silver, and blood money. The boy who once ran in the alleys of Dongri was now shaping the destiny of a city, one smuggled shipment at a time. It was during this time that the seeds of his future power, and his eventual downfall, were planted. The wealth gave him confidence, but it also drew enemies. The influence brought him protection, but it also caught the attention of those in power. Dawood Ibrahim had built an empire of smuggling, but empires built on shadows are always fragile. And as his name grew louder, the forces determined to silence him grew sharper. By the mid-1980s, Dawood Ibrahim was no longer just a name whispered in Dongri's narrow lanes or muttered in fear by rival gangs. He had become a figure of fascination, his shadow stretching far beyond the underworld and into the shimmering world of Bollywood. To understand Bombay, one had to understand its two beating hearts, crime and cinema. One thrived in the dark alleys, the other glowed on silver screens. And Dawood, with his unmatched instinct for power, bridged the two worlds seamlessly. Bollywood at this time was both glamorous and vulnerable. Film production was an expensive gamble, often funded by moneylenders who charged crushing interest rates. Producers, desperate to bring stories to life, were constantly searching for financiers who could inject quick cash. Dawood, flush with profits from smuggling, saw an opportunity. By financing films, he could launder his money, expand his influence, and gain access to the world of stars, directors, and music that captivated millions of Indians. Slowly, discreetly, D Company money began flowing into the veins of Bollywood. It started with small investments, uncredited loans to struggling producers or quiet backing of projects that others deemed too risky. But soon, Dawood's involvement became impossible to ignore. Films backed by his money suddenly had the best resources, star-studded casts, elaborate sets, and extravagant music launches. Success at the box office meant not only huge returns but also cultural power. When a film funded by Dawood's network played in crowded theaters, it wasn't just entertainment, it was a subtle reminder of his reach. Stars, too, felt the pull of his influence. Dawood had an eye for charisma, for personalities who could light up a room, whether they were actors, singers, or dancers. Many found themselves invited to his lavish parties in Dubai, where Bollywood mingled with underworld dons under glittering chandeliers. For young actors trying to climb the ladder, an association with Dawood could mean quicker access to roles, easier financing, and an aura of protection. But the relationship was double-edged. To turn down an invitation, to resist his charm, was often interpreted as disrespect. And disrespect was something Dawood never tolerated. One of the most enduring images of this era is of Dawood sitting in the front rows of cricket matches and Bollywood events, dressed sharply, surrounded by bodyguards, and flanked by celebrities. Photographs from the time show him smiling, enjoying the limelight, almost as if he were a film star himself. For a boy who had grown up in Dongri, watching movies in small, crowded halls, this was a transformation beyond imagination. The underworld don had become a celebrity, his name as recognizable as the actors he admired. But beneath the glamour lay darker currents. Bollywood was not merely a stage for Dawood's social rise, it was also a tool of control. Reports began to surface of actors and producers being threatened if they refused to cooperate. Some were forced to accept roles, while others were pressured into attending parties or public events. Extortion, too, became a shadow over the industry. Phone calls from anonymous voices demanded payments, often couched as protection money. Those who complied were left in peace, those who resisted faced dire consequences. The industry that entertained millions was, in reality, dancing to the tune of an invisible conductor. Yet, it would be simplistic to paint all of Bollywood as victims. Many stars willingly courted Dawood's attention, enjoying the lavish gifts, the exotic trips, and the sense of belonging to a circle that seemed untouchable. In an era where fame was fleeting and fortunes uncertain, Dawood's patronage provided stability, at least on the surface. Rumors of romances between stars and underworld-linked financiers filled gossip columns, blurring the line between cinema and crime. Dawood thrived in this blur, knowing that as long as Bollywood embraced him, his image would be larger than life. The parties in Dubai became legendary. Held in glittering hotels or sprawling villas, they were gatherings where alcohol flowed freely, music blared until dawn, and stars performed privately for an audience of dons and their associates. Stories circulated of Dawood dancing alongside famous actors, of actresses being flown in first class just to grace his parties, of singers serenading him with the latest hits. These gatherings were not just indulgences, they were displays of power. Every photograph, every whispered tale of a Bollywood star smiling at his side, cemented Dawood's image as more than a gangster. He was a kingmaker, a patron, and, in some ways, a star in his own right. But with fame came scrutiny. Journalists began asking uncomfortable questions. Why were so many films suddenly linked to Dawood's money? Why were certain actors untouchable, their careers seemingly protected by invisible forces? Law enforcement, too, began to take notice. The connection between Bollywood and the underworld became a public debate, a scandal that hinted at just how deep Dawood's influence had spread. Still, the glamour often overshadowed the danger. For every article that questioned his involvement, there were 10 photographs of him smiling among stars, reinforcing his carefully cultivated image as a charming, powerful figure. This duality, menace wrapped in charisma, became Dawood's hallmark. To his enemies, he was a ruthless don whose empire was built on violence. To the stars and producers who benefited from his patronage, he was a benefactor, a man who made dreams come true. And to the public, watching from the outside, he became a figure of fascination, the gangster who lived like a film star, blurring the lines between real and real. As the decade moved forward, Bollywood's connection with Dawood deepened. Films financed with his money shaped the cultural imagination of India, embedding his presence in songs, dialogues, and stories that millions consumed daily. But just as his stardom reached dazzling heights, shadows began to gather. Rival gangs grew resentful, the police sharpened their gaze, and whispers of betrayal began to circulate even within his trusted circle. The glamour that lifted him into the spotlight would soon prove to be a double-edged sword, drawing the kind of attention no Don could afford for long. For now, though, Dawood reveled in his role as the underworld superstar, the man who sat at the intersection of smuggling and cinema, crime and culture. He was no longer just a Don, he was the ghost who walked among film stars, the man whose story played out both in the streets of Bombay and in the dreams projected on silver screens. The late 1980s marked a violent turning point in Dawood Ibrahim's life and in the history of Bombay's underworld. For years, Dawood and his elder brother Shabur had been the twin pillars of D Company, the strategist and the warrior, the calculating mind and the fiery hand. Together, they had carved out a place in the smuggling trade, controlled neighborhoods with an iron grip, and extended their reach into Bollywood, politics, and beyond. But in the underworld, no empire grows without enemies, and no Don walks without shadows. The fragile balance that had allowed D Company to rise was about to be shattered. At the heart of the coming storm was Shabur Ibrahim Kaskar, Dawood's older brother and closest ally. Where Dawood was cautious, Shabur was bold to the point of recklessness. He loved the spotlight, flaunted his power, and rarely backed down from a challenge. Rivals knew that crossing Shabur meant instant retaliation, often delivered in broad daylight, with no concern for subtlety. This aggressiveness had cemented D Company's dominance, but it also painted a target on Shabur's back. Rival gangs, particularly the Pathans and members of the older Karim Lala syndicate, simmered with resentment. They saw Dawood's empire swallowing everything, the docks, the gold smuggling routes, the protection rackets. Shabur's fiery methods gave them the excuse they needed to strike. The feud reached its boiling point in 1981, when Shabur was lured into a trap. On what seemed like an ordinary day, he was reportedly called to a meeting near the Prabhadevi area of Bombay. Some accounts suggest he believed he was going to negotiate peace or discuss a business deal, others say he was confident enough in his power that he dismissed any warnings. Either way, as Shabur arrived at the location, gunmen were waiting. The ambush was swift, merciless, and final. Bullets ripped through the air, and Shabur, the fearless warrior of D Company, fell lifeless on the streets of Bombay. The city that had trembled at his name now watched in stunned silence as his blood soaked the pavement. News of Shabur's assassination spread like wildfire. For Dawood, it was more than the loss of a brother, it was a personal betrayal and a public humiliation. The empire they had built together was now in danger of collapse. Rivals celebrated, believing that D Company would crumble without its fiery enforcer. Police officers, long frustrated by Dawood's growing power, wondered if the Don's days were numbered. And ordinary citizens whispered in fear, knowing that this killing was not the end but the beginning of something far darker. The effect on Dawood was profound. Until that moment, he had been a calculating figure, blending charm with ambition, keeping his violence carefully measured. Shabur's death changed him. Grief hardened into rage, and rage sharpened into cold determination. Dawood vowed revenge, not just against those who had pulled the trigger, but against the entire network that had dared to challenge D Company. In the weeks and months that followed, Bombay witnessed a wave of retaliatory killings. One by one, the men believed to be responsible for Shabur's assassination were hunted down. Some were shot in crowded markets, others dragged from their homes, and still others vanished, their bodies never found. The message was clear: D Company would not forgive, and it would not forget. But revenge was only part of Dawood's transformation. Shabur's death forced him to evolve from a Don who shared power with his brothers into the undisputed leader of D Company. No longer content to remain in the shadows, Dawood embraced his role as supreme commander. He reorganized the gang, tightened discipline, and expanded operations with an even sharper focus. If Shabur had been the sword, Dawood became the shield and the crown. He shifted the organization away from reckless displays of violence and toward calculated expansion. The smuggling routes grew more sophisticated, the bribes more organized, and the structure of D Company more corporate. What had once been a family gang was now becoming an international syndicate. The streets of Bombay, however, paid the price for this transformation. The feud with rival gangs escalated into a bloody war. Shootouts erupted in neighborhoods that had once been merely crowded and noisy but were now battlegrounds. Innocent bystanders were sometimes caught in the crossfire, their lives collateral damage in the struggle for dominance. Fear seeped deeper into the city's veins. For many, it was impossible to imagine Bombay without the constant specter of violence, the knowledge that stepping into the wrong street at the wrong time could mean death. And yet, for Dawood, this period also solidified his legend. The way he responded to Shabir's death, with ruthless vengeance, unshakable control, and strategic brilliance, elevated him from just another gangster to the undisputed Don of Bombay. Rivals who had once mocked him as the boy from Dongri now spoke his name in hushed tones. Police dossiers began to describe him not just as a criminal but as the head of a criminal organization. Politicians, businessmen, and even Bollywood figures knew that Dawood was no longer just an investor or an enforcer. He was the man pulling strings, deciding who rose and who fell. Still, beneath the outward power, the personal loss lingered. Those close to Dawood whispered that Shabir's assassination had left a wound that never truly healed. For all his wealth, power, and influence, Dawood carried the weight of that day for the rest of his life. Some say it was Shabir's death that first planted the seeds of paranoia in him, the sense that betrayal could come from anywhere, that loyalty was always conditional. The ghost of his brother walked beside him, a reminder of both his vulnerability and his responsibility to ensure that D Company would never again be caught off guard. From this crucible of blood and loss, Dawood Ibrahim emerged not broken but reborn. He was no longer just the smuggler, the financier, or the charming Don who mingled with stars. He was the ghost Don in the making, a man who carried death in his shadow, who turned grief into power, and who transformed a brother's murder into the fuel that would drive him to expand his empire beyond anything Bombay had ever seen. The assassination of Shabir was not just a chapter in Dawood's story. It was the hinge on which his life turned. The boy from Dongri, the smuggler at the docks, the patron of Bollywood, all those identities faded into the background. What emerged was something far more formidable, a Don who ruled not through shared power but through absolute control, a man whose empire would stretch across oceans, and a ghost whose presence would haunt Bombay long after he was gone. Exile in Dubai was not just a change of address for Dawood Ibrahim, it was the transformation of a street Don into a global criminal mastermind. After the heat of Bombay became unbearable, police crackdowns tightening, rival gangs growing bolder, and whispers of political betrayals increasing, Dawood made the fateful decision to leave the city that had made him. To many, it seemed like an escape, an exile forced upon him by circumstances. But for Dawood, it was the beginning of something far greater. He was not fleeing Bombay, he was outgrowing it. The narrow lanes of Dongri and the crowded gullies of Nagpata could no longer contain the vision of a man who now thought in terms of continents, not neighborhoods. Dubai, in the 1980s and 1990s, was a city unlike any other. It was an oasis of wealth and opportunity, a place where fortunes could be made overnight. For smugglers and businessmen alike, Dubai's ports, free trade policies, and lack of strict extradition treaties made it a haven. To Dawood, it was the perfect base. From the moment he set foot there, he began weaving a network that combined the ruthlessness of the underworld with the sophistication of international finance. In Bombay, he had been a feared Don. In Dubai, he became something closer to a tycoon. He moved into lavish villas, drove luxury cars, and attended parties where Bollywood stars, politicians, and businessmen mingled freely. The smuggler from Dongri, now dressed in tailored suits, spoke the language of deals and investments, and presented himself as a respectable figure of wealth and influence. Behind the glittering facade, however, the machinery of D Company was being recalibrated. From Dubai, Dawood could direct operations with a freedom he never had in India. He no longer had to worry about street-level gang wars or constant raids. Instead, he focused on expansion. Gold smuggling routes that once ran through Bombay's docks were now transformed into sprawling international pipelines. Dubai's airports and shipping ports became conduits for not just gold but also electronics, narcotics, and counterfeit currency. The money flowed in torrents, laundered through legitimate businesses, real estate investments, and offshore accounts. One of Dawood's greatest strengths was his ability to merge the worlds of crime and commerce. While other dons remained stuck in the old ways, relying on extortion, protection money, and petty smuggling, Dawood built a criminal empire that looked, on the surface, like a multinational corporation. His lieutenants acted as managers, overseeing operations across different regions. He established trusted networks not only in Dubai and Bombay but also in Karachi, London, Hong Kong, and even parts of Africa. Each location became a node in the web of D Company, a global syndicate that stretched far beyond its roots. Bollywood, too, remained under his shadow. From Dubai, Dawood continued to invest in films, finance producers, and control distribution networks. Actors and directors still made the pilgrimage to his opulent homes, attending his parties, knowing that his influence could make or break careers. His ties to the film industry gave him cultural power that extended beyond fear. Dawood was no longer just a gangster in the background, he was a figure whose presence could be felt in the glamour of Indian cinema itself. Yet this glamour was always underpinned by menace. Those who crossed him or failed to deliver often found themselves threatened or worse, even from thousands of miles away. Politics, too, was never far from his reach. In Dubai, Dawood forged connections with influential businessmen and political figures. Some saw him as a useful ally, someone who could move money and influence across borders. Others tolerated him because of the wealth he brought into the city. In many ways, Dawood embodied Dubai's transformation during those years, a city where power and money blurred the lines between legitimacy and illegitimacy. His presence was an open secret, everyone knew who he was, yet few dared to challenge him. For Dawood personally, exile was also a shield. From Dubai, he was largely untouchable. Indian authorities issued warrants, filed cases, and sent requests for his extradition, but the legal maze of international diplomacy kept him safe. Interpol notices were issued, but Dawood continued to live openly, moving between his properties, attending cricket matches, and hosting high-profile guests. The image of the ghost Don only grew stronger. He was everywhere and nowhere, seen at a party one night, rumored to be in another country the next. The physical distance between him and Bombay only added to his myth, making him seem less like a gangster and more like an untouchable phantom who ruled from the shadows. Yet exile did not erase the blood in his story. From Dubai, Dawood oversaw hits in Bombay, settling scores with rivals, controlling the drug trade, and expanding his influence in South Asia. His hands reached into Karachi, where alliances with Pakistani intelligence agencies would later prove crucial. He also began cultivating connections with international cartels, particularly in the narcotics trade. What began as gold smuggling had now evolved into a diversified empire that touched everything from heroin routes in Afghanistan to money laundering in Europe. But this transformation came at a cost. Dawood could no longer walk the streets of Bombay, no longer sit in the tea shops of Domri where his empire began. He was surrounded by luxury but also by isolation. Exile gave him safety, but it also gave him distance, from his people, his city, and perhaps even from himself. He became a man who lived in palaces but carried the paranoia of someone always hunted. Every visitor was a potential spy, every deal a potential trap. He had wealth beyond imagination, but he also had the constant fear of betrayal and assassination. For Bombay, however, Dawood's exile did not mean relief. His presence in Dubai only amplified his influence. Violence continued in the city, his lieutenants fighting battles on his behalf. Police forces knew that the mastermind was out of reach, orchestrating chaos from the safety of another land. Dawood had turned exile into empowerment. He had traded the narrow lanes of his youth for the skyscrapers of Dubai, and in doing so, transformed himself into something far greater than a gangster. He became the ghost don of the Indian Ocean world, a figure whose empire stretched across borders, whose name was spoken in fear from Bombay to London, and whose shadow would haunt the subcontinent for decades to come. Exile, in the end, was not Dawood's punishment. It was his rebirth. It gave him distance, protection, and the space to think bigger than ever before. From Dubai, he became a global don, a master of both crime and illusion, and a man whose story blurred the lines between reality and myth. For those who still remembered him as the boy from Donri, it was almost impossible to reconcile that image with the figure who now ruled from luxurious mansions abroad. But that was Dawood Ibrahim's gift, to reinvent himself with every twist of fate, to turn every setback into a stepping stone. And in exile, he had found the ultimate vantage point, from which to command, to expand, and to become the ghost who could never be caught. The rise of D Company as a global syndicate marked one of the most extraordinary transformations in the history of organized crime. What had begun as a loose gang of smugglers and extortionists in the bustling neighborhoods of Bombay was now evolving into something unprecedented. From his secure base in Dubai, Dawood Ibrahim began to think not like a street don, but like a corporate strategist. Every move was calculated, every expansion carefully mapped, and every connection cultivated to ensure that his empire stretched far beyond the limits of India. D Company was no longer just a gang, it was a syndicate that blurred the lines between business and crime, legality and illegality, shadow and substance. At its core, D Company was structured like a multinational corporation. Dawood positioned himself as the chairman, the unquestioned authority who oversaw strategy and direction. Beneath him were his trusted lieutenants, men like Kota Shakil and Anis Ibrahim, who acted as managers of different departments within the organization. Some oversaw narcotics trafficking, others managed extortion and protection rackets, while still others focused on money laundering, smuggling, and international trade. Each division operated semi-independently but always funneled profits back to the top. This structure gave D Company both flexibility and resilience. If one arm was threatened, the others continued functioning seamlessly. The international reach of D Company was astonishing. Dubai served as the headquarters, a place where deals could be brokered without fear of law enforcement intrusion. But from there, the syndicate spread its influence across Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and even Europe. In Pakistan, particularly Karachi, Dawood cultivated relationships with intelligence operatives and political figures, securing safe havens and logistical support. In Hong Kong and Singapore, he tapped into smuggling and shipping networks that allowed the easy movement of contraband. In London, he explored real estate and money laundering, while in East Africa, his networks connected with local cartels and shipping enterprises. D Company became a web with Dawood at its center, its strands stretching into multiple continents. One of the most profitable wings of the syndicate was the drug trade. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Afghanistan had become the world's largest producer of opium. Through his contacts in Pakistan, Dawood established connections with Afghan warlords and traffickers. From the poppy fields of Helmand to the port cities of Karachi and onward to Dubai, heroin was smuggled with ruthless efficiency. D Company's routes extended to Europe and North America, where the demand for narcotics brought astronomical profits. Dawood was not merely dabbling in drugs, he was a key player in the global heroin trade, a shadowy figure whose influence reached addicts in faraway cities who had no idea of the empire that supplied their cravings. Alongside narcotics, D Company expanded into gold smuggling, a business Dawood had inherited from his early days in Bombay but scaled up to global proportions. With India's high import duties making gold a scarce commodity, Dawood used Dubai's free ports as a hub, flooding Indian markets with contraband gold. The profits were immense, and the operation also cemented D Company's ties with Indian businessmen, jewelers, and moneylenders who depended on the syndicate for supply. In many ways, Dawood's gold routes were the backbone of his empire, steady rivers of income that funded riskier ventures. The syndicate also infiltrated the world of finance. Counterfeit currency became one of its most notorious operations. By working with contacts in Pakistan and other regions, D Company flooded India with high-quality fake currency notes, destabilizing the economy and strengthening its own grip on illicit markets. At the same time, legitimate businesses, real estate projects, trading companies, and construction firms, were used to launder billions of dollars in profits. Dawood understood the importance of blending legality with illegality. By presenting himself as a businessman and using front companies, he was able to invest in ventures that gave his empire a veneer of respectability. Bollywood remained another critical front. Dawood's influence in the film industry was both cultural and financial. From Dubai, he funded movies, manipulated box office networks, and maintained close ties with actors and producers. Many insiders whispered of lavish parties where stars mingled with gangsters, of films financed by money earned through narcotics and smuggling. For Dawood, Bollywood was more than entertainment, it was a tool of soft power, a way to influence culture, spread his name, and maintain a glamorous image that masked his darker realities. Even as he was vilified in India's press, he was also adored in its cinema halls, an irony that underscored his unique place in the nation's psyche. Cricket, too, became entangled in the syndicate's reach. Dawood's presence in international cricket matches, often in the VIP stands, was both symbolic and strategic. He invested heavily in betting rackets, fixing matches, and manipulating odds in ways that made millions for his organization. Cricket, a sport almost sacred in India, became another arena where Dawood's hand was invisible yet undeniable. The scandal of match fixing in the 1990s would later expose the depth of this corruption, with fingers inevitably pointing toward D Company. What made D Company especially dangerous was its ability to operate as both a criminal cartel and a quasi-political entity. Dawood's connections with Pakistani intelligence services gave him protection that extended beyond bribery or corruption. There were allegations that his syndicate was occasionally used as a proxy, carrying out operations that served geopolitical agendas. Whether all of these claims were true or exaggerated, they added to the aura of D Company as not merely a criminal enterprise, but a shadow state, one that wielded money, violence, and influence across borders. The psychological impact of this rise cannot be overstated. For the people of Bombay, Dawood became less a man than a myth. His name was spoken in whispers, his reach exaggerated in rumors that often turned out to be true. Stories circulated of businessmen receiving calls from Dubai, of rivals vanishing overnight, of politicians bowing to invisible pressures. In exile, Dawood had become more powerful than ever before. He was not just feared, he was omnipresent. Yet even as D Company rose to global prominence, cracks were forming. The very scale of the operation made it vulnerable to betrayals, defections, and increased international scrutiny. Indian authorities, though unable to capture Dawood, intensified their pursuit of his associates. Foreign governments, too, began to take note of the ghost don whose empire stretched into their own cities. The success of D Company sowed the seeds of its eventual troubles. But in the moment, in the height of its power, it seemed unstoppable, a syndicate unlike any the subcontinent had ever seen, a global criminal empire with Dawood Ibrahim as its untouchable king. D Company's rise was not merely the story of one gangster's ambition, it was the story of how crime itself had evolved in the late 20th century. Local gangs had become international networks, petty racketeering had turned into corporate-style management, and one man had managed to ride these waves with ruthless brilliance. Dawood Ibrahim had turned exile into opportunity, opportunity into empire, and empire into legend. And as the 1990s loomed, the shadow of D Company stretched further than ever, casting darkness not only over Bombay but over entire regions of the world. Shadows over Bombay in the early 1990s were no longer the simple, direct threats of gangsters lurking in the alleyways or extortionists demanding money at gunpoint. The shadows now stretched across seas and borders, emanating from luxurious villas in Dubai where Dawood Ibrahim sat like a general commanding a distant battlefield. Bombay was his city still, its businesses, its streets, and its people moved under the invisible weight of his gaze. Though exile had placed physical distance between Dawood and his homeland, it had not weakened his grip. In fact, the The separation made his control more mysterious, more terrifying, and more absolute. The Don was no longer a man in the city, he was a presence that hovered above it, untouchable, his voice traveling through telephones, his orders delivered through loyal lieutenants. Bombay in this period was a city in transition. The liberalization of India's economy was beginning to reshape commerce and industry, opening doors to foreign investment, new markets, and a rising middle class. Yet beneath this promise of growth, the old currents of crime and corruption surged stronger than ever. Extortion rackets continued to strangle businessmen, and politicians leaned heavily on underworld support to fuel campaigns and secure influence. Dawood, sitting oceans away, remained central to this ecosystem. His men collected protection money, ensured cooperation, and resolved disputes, not with courts or contracts, but with the sharp efficiency of threats and bullets. What made Dawood's rule particularly insidious was the way he combined fear with invisibility. Businessmen across Bombay received phone calls from anonymous numbers, a voice calmly explaining the terms of protection. Few dared to resist. They knew the caller was speaking on behalf of Dawood, and even if the Don himself was thousands of miles away, his reach was immediate. Payments were often routed through shell companies or delivered via couriers, a system so well-oiled that it felt less like extortion and more like an unspoken tax, the price of doing business in a city that moved under his control. For politicians, the shadows were both a shield and a sword. Some aligned themselves with Dawood, leveraging his money and muscle during elections. Campaigns were funded through underworld channels, rallies secured by men who answered not to the state, but to the Don. Others, fearful or resentful of his influence, tried to resist, but resistance often came at a cost. Dawood had the ability to turn communities against leaders, to disrupt local economies, and to unleash chaos through his rival gangs. He was not just a gangster anymore, he was a parallel power, a figure who could tilt the balance of politics without ever showing his face. The cultural sphere was no less haunted by his presence. Bollywood remained entwined with the underworld, and even from afar, Dawood exerted influence over film productions, distribution, and casting. Stories circulated of actors receiving invitations to parties in Dubai, an invitation that was less a request and more a command. Many who attended described an atmosphere of surreal luxury, where the glamour of film stars mingled with the menace of men who dealt in narcotics and smuggling. Those who cooperated benefited from funding, protection, and opportunities. Those who refused found doors mysteriously closing, projects stalling, or worse, threats arriving at their doorstep. This atmosphere of control from afar gave rise to one of the most unique aspects of Dawood's reign, the myth of omnipresence. People believed he knew everything happening in Bombay, that no decision in the underworld could be made without his knowledge. Rival gangs might attempt to rise, but somehow Dawood always seemed to anticipate their moves. His lieutenants, like Kota Shakil, carried out his commands with loyalty bordering on devotion. They became his eyes, ears, and fists within the city, ensuring that the Don's absence never created a vacuum. But as the shadows deepened, the cracks in Bombay's underworld began to widen. Rivalries, once checked by Dawood's direct presence, started to grow more volatile. The Arun Govli gang, among others, began challenging D Company's dominance. Local disputes escalated into violent confrontations, leaving blood on the streets and fear in the hearts of ordinary citizens. Yet even in these moments, Dawood's distance gave him a peculiar advantage. He could remain untouchable, above the fray, while his enemies and rivals destroyed themselves in battles fought on the ground. For the city's ordinary residents, Dawood's control was both visible and invisible. They saw it in the shuttered shops of businessmen who refused to pay protection money, in the sudden strikes of violence that erupted without warning, and in the whispered warnings not to cross certain lines. At the same time, they also saw the strange stability his rule brought. Rival gangs rarely grew too powerful, because Dawood's invisible hand would push back. Communities that aligned themselves with his network enjoyed a measure of protection and prosperity. In a paradoxical way, his shadows both suffocated and shielded the city. One of the most chilling aspects of this period was the way Dawood blurred the line between criminal and legitimate enterprise. His investments in construction, real estate, and finance made him a player in Bombay's official economy, even as his underworld operations thrived. Many businessmen found themselves dealing with his front companies without even realizing it. The Don was both the invisible predator and the hidden partner, feeding on the city's wealth while also fueling its growth. The psychological impact of Dawood's distant control was immense. Unlike earlier Dons, who had to walk the streets, fight battles, and risk police encounters, Dawood had elevated himself into something spectral. He no longer fought for territory, he commanded it from afar. This made him less human in the eyes of many, less a gangster and more a force, like a storm that could not be stopped, only endured. Rumors of his whereabouts, one day in Dubai, the next in Karachi, perhaps even in London, added to the mystique. To the people of Bombay, he was everywhere and nowhere at once. And yet, these very shadows also began to breed paranoia. As his influence grew, so too did the resistance. Rivals sought to exploit his distance, law enforcement agencies grew bolder in their attempts to dismantle his networks, and political shifts threatened to unravel the alliances he had carefully cultivated. Dawood's dominance over Bombay was immense, but it was also precarious, built on fear, loyalty, and secrecy, all of which could unravel under the weight of betrayal or exposure. In the end, this era of control from afar was a double-edged sword. It gave Dawood safety, freedom, and the aura of invincibility, but it also deepened the city's dependence on a man who could never return, never step into the light. Bombay lived under his shadow, thriving and suffering in equal measure, a city haunted by the presence of a Don who was no longer there, yet never truly gone. The year 1993 marked the darkest chapter in Bombay's modern history, a moment when the shadows of Dawood Ibrahim's empire revealed their most devastating power. The city, already simmering with tension, was suddenly thrown into chaos as a series of coordinated bomb blasts tore through its heart on March 12. In less than 3 hours, Bombay, India's financial capital, its cultural hub, and its most restless metropolis, was shattered. The blasts killed over 250 people, injured more than 700, and left scars that still haunt the collective memory of the nation. For the first time, the Don who had long haunted Bombay from afar was no longer just a gangster, he was accused of being the mastermind of one of the most audacious acts of urban terror in India's history. The events leading up to that terrible day were years in the making. Bombay in the early 1990s was a city divided. The demolition of the Babri Masjid in Ayodhya in 1992 had triggered riots across India, and Bombay became the epicenter of this communal violence. Hindu-Muslim clashes ravaged the city, leaving over 1,000 people dead in January 1993. Neighborhoods burned, families were uprooted, and old wounds were ripped open with brutal force. Dawood, himself a Muslim who had grown up in Bombay's mixed neighborhoods, watched these events from afar. To many of his close associates, the riots were a turning point, a moment of fury and alienation that deepened the underworld's sense of betrayal. Out of that bitterness, the plan for the bombings was born. The blasts were not random explosions but a meticulously coordinated assault. 13 bombs detonated across Bombay in key locations: the Bombay Stock Exchange, the Air India Building, Jhaveri Bazaar, Plaza Cinema, and even at the offices of government institutions. Each target was carefully chosen for its symbolic and economic value. The stock exchange attack alone killed nearly 50 people, sending shockwaves through India's financial markets. Ordinary citizens, workers, traders, and commuters were caught in the inferno of violence, their lives torn apart in moments that seemed incomprehensible. The scale of the operation suggested planning far beyond the capacity of a local gang. Investigators soon uncovered trails that led back to Dawood's network in Dubai and Karachi. His close lieutenant, Tiger Mayman, emerged as one of the key organizers on the ground, while Dawood was accused of providing logistical and financial backing. Weapons and explosives, including RDX, a military-grade substance rarely seen in India, had been smuggled in through the syndicate's established routes. The same networks that had once carried gold and narcotics were now used to transport the tools of mass destruction. For Bombay, the psychological shock was profound. Until then, the city had been plagued by gang wars, extortion rackets, and sporadic violence, but nothing on this scale. The blasts felt like an invasion, an attack not just on people but on the very spirit of the metropolis. Office workers feared returning to high-rises, traders hesitated in crowded bazaars, and the city's legendary resilience was shaken to its core. Fear lingered in every public space, and whispers of Dawood's role spread like wildfire. The Don, once known as a smuggler and gangster, was now being called a terrorist. The investigations that followed were massive in scope. Indian intelligence agencies, police forces, and international partners began piecing together the conspiracy. Testimonies from arrested conspirators painted a chilling picture: training camps in Pakistan, funding routed through Dubai, and coordination at the highest levels of D Company. Dawood Ibrahim's name appeared again and again. Though he denied direct involvement, his image as the ghost Don became darker than ever. He was no longer simply the man who collected protection money or controlled smuggling networks, he was the alleged architect of a crime that had shaken an entire nation. For Dawood himself, the blasts marked a point of no return. Until then, his exile in Dubai had been one of semi-legitimacy. He was a wanted man in India, but he maintained a veneer of respectability abroad. After 1993, that facade crumbled. The Indian government officially branded him a terrorist, Interpol notices were renewed with greater urgency, and international pressure began mounting on the Gulf states that had once tolerated his presence. Dubai, once his safe haven, grew uncomfortable under the spotlight of global scrutiny. Eventually, Dawood shifted his base to Karachi, under the protection of Pakistani intelligence services. His exile had become permanent, and his transformation from gangster to fugitive terrorist was complete. The human toll of the blasts, however, remained the most enduring legacy. Families who lost loved ones struggled to make sense of their grief. Survivors bore scars both physical and emotional, their lives altered forever. Bombay itself, resilient as always, slowly picked up the pieces, but the city was never quite the same. The blasts exposed vulnerabilities that could be exploited by criminal syndicates, and they introduced a new, more terrifying form of violence into the Indian consciousness: organized, large-scale urban terrorism. The blasts also triggered a renewed wave of gangland conflict. Dawood's involvement, whether direct or orchestrated through his lieutenants, divided the underworld. Some of his former allies distanced themselves, unwilling to carry the burden of being associated with mass killings. Others, especially rival gangs like that of Arun Govli, exploited the moment to challenge D Company's supremacy. Violence escalated once more in Bombay's streets, with tit-for-tat killings and vendettas erupting in neighborhoods already reeling from the trauma of the blasts. Politically, the bombings hardened the state's stance against Dawood. His once subtle alliances with politicians evaporated under the glare of public outrage. The government intensified its crackdown on the underworld, launching operations that dismantled many of Dawood's networks in India. Yet, the Don himself remained elusive, protected by borders, diplomacy, and the secrecy of his movements. His ghostly presence haunted the city even more profoundly now, not just as a distant gangster but as an exile accused of orchestrating terror. For the people of Bombay, the blasts became a grim marker of time. There was a before and after, and nothing could erase the memories of smoke rising from skyscrapers, of shattered glass littering the streets, of anguished cries echoing in hospitals. Dawood Ibrahim, the boy from Dongri who once chased small dreams in crowded lanes, had become a figure whose decisions left hundreds dead and a city wounded. The metamorphosis was chilling, from smuggler to Don, from Don to syndicate boss, and now, from syndicate boss to fugitive terrorist. The 1993 blasts revealed the true scale of Dawood's empire and the depth of his reach. They also revealed the limits of the state's ability to bring him to justice. He had struck at the heart of India, yet remained out of its grasp, his shadow longer and darker than ever before. For Bombay, for India, and for Dawood himself, the blasts were a turning point. They marked the end of innocence for the city, the end of legitimacy for the Don, and the beginning of an era in which his name would forever be linked not just to crime, but to terror. After the 1993 Bombay blasts, the shadow of Dawood Ibrahim grew heavier than ever before. Until then, he had been regarded primarily as a crime lord, a man who ran smuggling networks, extortion rackets, and betting syndicates. But after the coordinated bombings that shook Bombay and claimed hundreds of lives, his reputation transformed into something far more sinister. The Indian government branded him the principal architect of terror, Interpol notices were renewed with greater urgency, and every international spotlight turned toward the Don who had once moved freely through the glittering high-rises of Dubai. It was a turning point not only for Bombay but also for Dawood himself, because this was the moment when exile became permanent, and survival meant slipping deeper into the shadows. Dubai, the city that had once embraced him, could no longer shield him. The United Arab Emirates faced tremendous diplomatic pressure from India and other nations after the blasts. The safe haven Dawood had built there, mansions, offices, and connections in the corridors of power, suddenly began to crumble. The Gulf monarchies had tolerated his presence because he brought wealth, influence, and a semblance of stability, but when global attention painted him as the financier of terrorism, they had little choice but to distance themselves. Within months, Dawood relocated once again, this time to Pakistan, where the protection of state elements and intelligence agencies would offer him the sanctuary he desperately needed. Karachi became his new base, and it was here that the Don evolved into something resembling a ghost. He was seen rarely, photographed almost never, and his presence was whispered about more than it was confirmed. Reports placed him in Clifton, an upscale neighborhood where sprawling villas overlooked the Arabian Sea. Others claimed he lived under heavy protection in guarded compounds with layers of security. Wherever he was, Dawood adapted to his new reality. The man who had once thrived in Bombay's chaos now lived in secrecy, shielded by the complexities of geopolitics. Pakistan, officially denying his presence, offered a kind of invisible cage, safe from extradition, but never truly free. His daily life became the stuff of legend, colored by speculation and fragmented accounts. Some said Dawood had embraced a pious existence, turning to religion, surrounding himself with clerics, and renouncing the flamboyant lifestyle that had once defined him. Others painted a picture of continued extravagance, lavish parties, luxury cars, and high-stakes gambling within the walls of his Karachi estate. Whichever version was closer to the truth, one thing was certain: Dawood Ibrahim remained at the center of a sprawling empire, directing operations with the precision of a man who trusted no one and feared everyone. The network he built did not collapse with his exile. Instead, it adapted, transforming into a transnational web that stretched across continents. From Karachi, his lieutenants continued to run D Company's operations in Mumbai, Dubai, London, and beyond. Smuggling routes shifted from gold to narcotics, from weapons to counterfeit currency. Dawood's connections with global criminal syndicates deepened, especially in the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and Africa. The betting industry, particularly cricket match fixing, became another pillar of his empire, pulling him further into notoriety. His name was whispered in the corridors of international law enforcement agencies, but his face remained hidden, an elusive figure who could not be captured. At the same time, Dawood's ties with militant organizations and state actors grew. Intelligence reports claimed that his network provided logistical support to extremist groups, blurring the line between crime and jihad. The same smuggling channels once used for contraband were now allegedly used to move arms and explosives. His alleged protection under the wing of Pakistan's intelligence establishment made him untouchable, and this association only reinforced his transformation from gangster into a global fugitive with political value. For India, this was an unbearable insult. The man who had orchestrated one of its darkest days was living comfortably just across the border, protected by the very forces it considered hostile. For the people of Bombay, Dawood's absence did not erase his presence. His ghost lingered in the streets he once ruled. Murals appeared in Dongri and Nagpada, neighborhoods whispered stories of his childhood, and songs in Bollywood films romanticized the outlaw who had escaped the state's grasp. His exile fed his legend. The further away he was, the larger he became in imagination. He was a villain to many, a symbol of rebellion to some, and to others, a reminder of the thin line between glamour and violence in the underworld's mythos. Yet exile carried its own costs. Dawood lived in constant fear of betrayal. He trusted few, often moving between safe houses, guarded by layers of bodyguards and surveillance. Friends from his past in Bombay were no longer close, many had turned rivals, some had been killed, and others had distanced themselves to avoid the burden of his notoriety. His family became both his strength and his vulnerability. His children grew up in Karachi and Dubai, away from the streets their father once ruled, and though they lived in comfort, they carried the stigma of a name too infamous to escape. Internationally, Dawood became a priority target. The United States added him to its list of global terrorists under the Patriot Act, freezing his assets and sanctioning his businesses. India continued pressing for his extradition, presenting evidence of his involvement not only in the 1993 blasts but also in later terror activities, including funding networks connected to groups operating against Indian interests. Despite mounting international pressure, Dawood remained out of reach, shielded by the denials of the Pakistani state and the complexities of international diplomacy. As the years passed, Dawood's life in Karachi took on the feel of a paradox. He was both everywhere and nowhere, commanding a global network yet confined within the invisible boundaries of his sanctuary. His empire thrived in real estate, narcotics, hawala, and sports betting, but his personal movements were restricted to the shadows. Rare leaks of photographs, grainy, outdated, often unverifiable, were the only glimpses the world had of him. Rumors of his health fluctuated. Some claimed he was critically ill, others insisted he remained sharp and commanding, still directing the flows of money and power. The aftermath of the blasts and his permanent exile in Karachi cemented his transformation. Dawood Ibrahim was no longer just the boy from Dongri who had risen to dominate Bombay's underworld. He had become something far larger and far more enigmatic, a global fugitive, a phantom whose name carried weight in crime syndicates, intelligence briefings, and popular culture alike. His story blurred the boundaries of crime, politics, and terror, making him one of the most notorious figures of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. For India, the wound remained raw. Every anniversary of the blasts rekindled demands for his capture, every terror attack invoked his name as a symbol of unpunished guilt, and every diplomatic exchange with Pakistan carried his ghost as an unspoken presence. For Dawood, life in Karachi may have been safe, but it was also a prison of paranoia, exile, and endless waiting. The boy who once sought control of a city now lived in the grip of forces larger than himself, international law, geopolitics, and the weight of his own legend. In exile, Dawood Ibrahim became both less visible and more powerful. His physical absence from Bombay only deepened his myth, turning him into a phantom who haunted the imagination of millions. He was no longer just a don, he was an enigma, a symbol of how crime and politics could intertwine to create a figure who could not be touched, no matter how hard nations tried. The exile of Dawood Ibrahim to Karachi did not bring silence to Mumbai's underworld. In fact, his absence created a dangerous vacuum, one that would be filled with blood, betrayal, and the rise of rivals who once stood in his shadow. For years, Dawood's D Company had operated like a well-oiled machine, its dominance unquestioned, its reach extending into every corner of the city, from real estate and construction to Bollywood and cricket betting. But with the Don now a ghost across the border, cracks began to appear in the empire. Those who had long bowed their heads before Dawood now sensed an opportunity to carve out their own kingdoms. The streets of Mumbai once again became battlegrounds, where gunfire echoed through narrow alleys and loyalty shifted like sand in the wind. The most significant challenge came from within Dawood's own circle. Kota Rajan, once his trusted lieutenant and close ally, broke away, declaring war on D Company. Their split was not just personal but ideological. Rajan, who considered himself more rooted in the soil of India, was appalled by Dawood's alleged involvement in the 1993 Bombay blasts. Where Dawood embraced associations with Pakistan's intelligence networks and international terror outfits, Rajan positioned himself as a nationalist gangster, a strange paradox of crime and patriotism. This divide would spark one of the bloodiest gang wars in Mumbai's history, a conflict that pitted former brothers-in-arms against one another in a brutal struggle for dominance. The streets bore witness to this war. Rajan's men and Dawood's loyalists hunted each other with ruthless precision. Shootouts erupted in crowded markets, in film studios, and even on the doorsteps of luxury hotels. One of the most infamous incidents was the attack on music baron Gulshan Kumar in 1997, an event that highlighted the intertwining of Bollywood and the underworld. While Dawood's men were accused of orchestrating the murder, Rajan's gang also engaged in high-profile killings to make their mark. Suddenly, the glamorous connection between film stars and gangsters turned toxic, with actors, producers, and financiers forced to pick sides, or pay the price for neutrality. Yet Rajan was not Dawood's only rival. The vacuum of Dawood's absence also opened space for smaller gangs that had once lived in his shadow. The Arun Govli gang, operating out of Dagdi Chaul, rose with renewed ferocity. Govli, unlike Dawood, projected himself as a Robin Hood figure, drawing support from local communities, particularly in central Mumbai. His charisma and political aspirations helped him establish a base that was harder for the state to dismantle. The lines between crime and politics blurred as Govli transformed from a gangster into an elected legislator, showing how deeply the underworld had embedded itself into the fabric of the city. The fragmentation of the underworld also reshaped the way crime was organized. Where Dawood had built a centralized empire with layers of hierarchy, the splintered gangs created a decentralized chaos. Extortion rackets became more unpredictable, kidnappings more frequent, and the sense of fear among businessmen, builders, and film producers grew sharper. No longer was there a single authority to negotiate with, multiple gangs demanded their share, often violently. The city that Dawood once controlled with an iron grip descended into a kind of anarchic underworld free-for-all. This era also witnessed the rise of a new breed of gangsters, those who operated less through the spectacle of violence and more through silent financial manipulation. Dawood's exile meant his control over the have-to system, protection money collected from shops, bars, and businesses, was weakened. Into this gap stepped groups who specialized in hawala transactions, counterfeit currency, and international smuggling networks. While Rajan and Govli fought openly with guns on the streets, others built quieter empires, thriving in the shadows left behind by Dawood's retreat. Bollywood, as always, remained entangled in this web. In the 1980s and early 1990s, Dawood had been known to bankroll films, attend parties with stars, and even influence casting decisions. With his exile, rival gangs saw an opening to assert influence over the industry. Producers who had once relied on Dawood's patronage now found themselves at the mercy of multiple gangs. Phone calls demanding extortion payments became common, and film shootings were often disrupted by threats or violence. This not only reshaped the industry's financial structures but also changed its creative landscape, as films began to reflect the violence and paranoia of the very world in which they were being made. The Indian state, too, sensed its opportunity in this chaos. Where Dawood had been untouchable, his rivals were more vulnerable. The Mumbai police, backed by elite encounter specialists, launched aggressive campaigns against gangs. Encounter killings became a notorious feature of the era, with gangsters being gunned down in staged shootouts. While the police justified these actions as a means of reclaiming the city, critics argued that the state was blurring the lines between justice and vigilantism. Nevertheless, these operations weakened many of the smaller gangs, though Rajan and Govli continued to hold their ground for years. Kota Rajan, in particular, became a global fugitive much like his former mentor. Operating from Thailand, Malaysia, and later Australia, Rajan built his own network that spanned continents. But unlike Dawood, he lacked the same level of protection and international influence. Over time, his empire began to shrink, and his life on the run left him vulnerable. In later years, he would eventually be captured and extradited to India, marking the end of his long rivalry with Dawood. Meanwhile, Dawood continued to loom over the city from afar. Even in exile, his influence persisted. Hawala networks tied to D Company funneled money into real estate projects, drug trafficking, and even international betting syndicates. The splintering of the underworld did not erase his shadow, it merely made it more complex. Dawood was no longer the sole monarch of Mumbai's criminal world, but his name remained the most feared, the most whispered, and the most enduring. The rise of rivals also highlighted an important shift. The underworld was no longer just about territory or street power. It had become deeply entwined with politics, finance, and international networks. The days of gangsters simply ruling neighborhoods with guns were fading. Now they shaped elections, manipulated markets, and operated in the globalized shadows of money laundering and arms trafficking. Dawood, from his safe haven, was both a participant in and a symbol of this transformation. For ordinary Mumbaikars, however, the splintering meant heightened insecurity. The 1990s and early 2000s were marked by stories of extortion calls, kidnappings, and gang wars spilling onto public streets. Builders hesitated to launch projects without underworld clearance, and many small businesses were forced into bankruptcy under the weight of protection money. Fear became woven into daily life, a reminder that the underworld was no longer centralized but fractured into unpredictable forces. Looking back, Dawood's exile created a paradoxical outcome. On the one hand, his physical absence weakened his direct control and allowed rivals like Kota Rajan and Arun Govli to rise. On the other, the splintering of power meant the city was plagued with more instability and violence than before. In trying to replace Dawood, the rival gangs ended up fracturing the order he had maintained, plunging Mumbai into a decade of chaos. And yet, even in this fractured landscape, one reality remained unchanged: Dawood Ibrahim's name continued to haunt the city. Rivals might rise, police encounters might wipe out lieutenants, and politicians might boast of cracking down on crime, but Dawood's legend endured. From the safe houses of Karachi, he remained the ghost Don, the man whose absence was as powerful as his presence had once been. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Dawood Ibrahim's empire had shifted from the narrow lanes of Mumbai into a sprawling, borderless phenomenon. What had once begun as gold smuggling on the docks of Bombay had now matured into a sophisticated, multi-billion-dollar criminal enterprise that touched every continent. The exile in Karachi forced Dawood to adapt. He could no longer command the streets of Mumbai directly, but he could reimagine D Company as a transnational organization, one that thrived on globalization itself. In a world becoming increasingly connected through trade, technology, and finance, Dawood's network exploited the very mechanisms that fueled legitimate economies. At the core of this transformation was the diversification of D Company's operations. Gold smuggling, once its lifeline, had become outdated as the Indian economy liberalized and restrictions eased. Dawood turned to narcotics trafficking, seeing opportunity in the heroin trade that flowed from Afghanistan through Pakistan and into global markets. Karachi, conveniently situated as a port city, became a hub for transporting shipments hidden within containers bound for the Middle East, Africa, and Europe. Reports from international agencies suggested that D Company collaborated with other cartels, particularly in Southeast Asia, creating pipelines of drugs that moved alongside legitimate goods. It was a business of shadows, cloaked in the language of global trade. Narcotics were only one pillar. Counterfeit currency became another. Dawood's network, allegedly supported by elements of Pakistan's establishment, began producing and distributing fake Indian currency on a massive scale. This was not just a criminal operation but also a form of economic warfare, designed to destabilize India's financial system. The notes found their way into markets across South Asia and the Gulf, often indistinguishable from the real currency. Hawala, the ancient system of informal money transfers, became the nervous system of D Company's global empire, moving billions of dollars through invisible channels that bypassed traditional banking oversight. Sports betting, especially cricket, became another lucrative arm. Cricket was not just a sport in South Asia, it was a passion bordering on obsession, and Dawood understood the psychology of betting better than most. Through bookies spread across India, Dubai, and the UK, D Company manipulated matches, influenced odds, and laundered money. The 2000 cricket match-fixing scandal exposed how deeply embedded Dawood's network had become in the game, tarnishing the reputations of celebrated players and shaking the very faith of millions of fans. While official investigations brought parts of the scandal to light, much of D Company's influence remained hidden, operating in the gray zones where law and obsession collided. Real estate, too, became central to Dawood's operations. Property development in Dubai, Karachi, and even parts of London provided both profit and cover for laundering illicit wealth. Lavish towers, luxury apartments, and commercial complexes bore no obvious trace of underworld money, yet they were the silent monuments to D Company's reach. In Mumbai, despite his exile, Dawood's proxies continued to hold sway over prime properties through intimidation and fraudulent transactions. Builders were often forced into partnerships, and land disputes were settled through the invisible hand of D Company. What made this global empire sustainable was Dawood's ability to forge alliances. Unlike the solitary dons of earlier decades, Dawood operated more like the head of a consortium, striking deals with international cartels, terrorist outfits, and even corrupt officials. Intelligence reports often linked him to groups in Afghanistan and the Middle East, where his smuggling routes overlapped with those used by militants. These alleged partnerships blurred the lines between crime, politics, and terrorism, ensuring that D Company was not merely a criminal network but also a geopolitical actor. The United States, recognizing the scale of Dawood's influence, officially designated him a global terrorist in 2003 under the specially designated global terrorist list. This placed him in the same category as figures like Osama bin Laden, freezing his assets and sanctioning his businesses worldwide. For Dawood, this recognition was both a curse and a badge of power. It made travel and international dealings riskier, but it also elevated his myth. He was no longer just a gangster, he was a figure whose name appeared in intelligence briefings across Washington, London, and New Delhi. Despite the scrutiny, D Company thrived precisely because of its adaptability. Where law enforcement agencies worked within borders, Dawood operated across them. When one smuggling route closed, another opened. When one proxy was arrested, another rose. The network was structured less like a pyramid and more like a web, with Dawood at its center but multiple strands radiating outward, resilient to shocks. His lieutenants operated semi-independently in Dubai, Malaysia, Nepal, and even South Africa, ensuring that the Don's orders could ripple outward without exposing him directly. Culturally, Dawood's globalization also influenced perceptions of the underworld. He became a symbol not only of India's crime problem but of how crime itself had changed in the modern world. No longer confined to a city or even a country, organized crime had merged seamlessly with global commerce. Shipping routes, financial markets, sports, and real estate, all became arenas where the Don's invisible hand played its part. Bollywood, too, continued to reflect this transformation, producing films that dramatized international cartels and shadowy Dons, often drawing inspiration, directly or indirectly, from Dawood's life. Yet globalization brought with it a different kind of vulnerability. Dawood was no longer just India's problem, he had become a thorn in the side of multiple governments. His connections with drug trafficking made him a target of the DEA, his alleged terror financing drew the attention of the CIA, and his counterfeit currency operations placed him on the radar of financial watchdogs worldwide. Unlike in the days of Mumbai's gang wars, his enemies were no longer just rival Dons or police officers, they were global agencies with far-reaching powers. For Dawood personally, this era marked a strange duality. On one hand, he was more powerful than ever, orchestrating a global empire from the safety of Karachi. On the other, he was increasingly trapped, unable to leave Pakistan without risking capture, unable to show his face without inviting danger. His empire thrived in anonymity, and so too did he. His life became an echo of the network he controlled, invisible, adaptive, and always just out of reach. By the early 2000s, D Company had become a case study in how globalization reshaped organized crime. It was no longer about a gang ruling a few neighborhoods, it was about a network that spanned continents, blurred the line between legality and illegality, and proved nearly impossible to dismantle. Dawood Ibrahim, the boy from Dongri who once smuggled gold bars, had transformed into the head of a global syndicate, a figure as elusive as he was powerful, as despised as he was admired in the mythology of crime. The Don who once haunted the streets of Mumbai now haunted the corridors of international law enforcement. His empire was borderless, his enemies countless, and his legend still growing. In this new phase of his life, Dawood Ibrahim ceased to be merely a gangster, he became an embodiment of the dark side of globalization itself. The early 2000s marked a strange transformation in the life of Dawood Ibrahim. After years of notoriety, media frenzy, and constant international spotlight, the Don seemed to vanish into silence. Once, his name filled newspaper headlines daily, whispered in police briefings and glamorized in Bollywood storylines. But as the world turned to new wars, new terror threats, and new villains, Dawood slipped further into the shadows. These years became known as his silent years, a period when little was certain about his whereabouts, his health, or even the state of his empire. And yet, paradoxically, it was in this silence that the mythology around Dawood grew louder. Whispers began to replace facts. Some claimed Dawood was living quietly in Karachi's Clifton area, surrounded by armed guards and high walls. Others insisted he had moved to Islamabad under an assumed identity, hidden within the layers of Pakistan's powerful establishment. There were stories that he prayed 5 times a day, leading a reclusive and deeply religious life. Other rumors contradicted this, painting him as still lavish, hosting private parties and gambling behind closed doors. Like all great myths, the truth lay somewhere in between, obscured by layers of secrecy and deliberate misinformation. The rumors extended beyond his lifestyle into his health. Every few years, reports surfaced of Dawood's critical illness, cancer, kidney failure, or heart disease. Some newspapers boldly declared he was on his deathbed, only for the claims to be dismissed by security agencies days later. This pattern of rumors served a dual purpose. For the Indian public, it rekindled fleeting hope that the end of Dawood's reign might come naturally, sparing them the agony of waiting for justice. For Dawood himself, the ambiguity became a weapon. The less people knew about his condition, the more untouchable he seemed. A man who could not be seen could not be targeted. In Mumbai, his silence only deepened his ghostly presence. Even in exile, his name was invoked in connection with crimes that bore the faintest resemblance to his methods. Extortion calls, property disputes, and hawala cases often carried the stamp of D Company, whether or not Dawood himself had ordered them. It was as though his name had become shorthand for the invisible hand behind Mumbai's underworld. Rival gangsters had either been eliminated, imprisoned, or faded into irrelevance, yet Dawood's specter persisted, his absence making him even more present. The silence also created fertile ground for conspiracy theories. Some believed Dawood was no longer in Pakistan at all, that he had secretly struck deals to live elsewhere, perhaps in the Middle East, protected by nations that valued his connections. A few even suggested he had returned to India under a false identity, living undetected in plain sight. These theories, far-fetched as they seemed, thrived precisely because of the lack of verifiable information. When a man disappears from view but leaves behind such a massive shadow, imagination takes over where evidence cannot reach. Bollywood continued to keep his legend alive during these years. Films inspired by his life, sometimes overtly, sometimes thinly disguised, captured the public's fascination. Characters modeled after Dawood were portrayed as both villains and anti-heroes, embodying the contradictions of charm and ruthlessness. Audiences, especially younger generations who had not lived through his active reign, absorbed his story as entertainment, further blurring the line between the man and the myth. For many, Dawood was no longer a flesh-and-blood fugitive, he was an archetype, a symbol of the gangster figure that lived forever in popular imagination. Behind the silence, however, D Company endured. The network Dawood had built was designed to outlast his visibility. Hawala channels continued to move money, narcotics pipelines flowed across Asia and Africa, betting syndicates thrived. But unlike in earlier decades, Dawood's name did not appear directly in these operations. His lieutenants and relatives became the visible faces, while he remained hidden. This distancing was strategic. It allowed the empire to function even if certain branches were cut down. The Ghost Don no longer needed to show his hand to maintain control, his legacy and reputation did the work for him. International agencies struggled with this invisibility. While the United States and India had placed Dawood high on their wanted lists, actionable intelligence was scarce. Satellite images, intercepted phone calls, and human intelligence reports often contradicted each other. In one version, Dawood was living a secluded life under the protection of Pakistan's ISI, in another, he was operating freely, traveling to Dubai and Saudi Arabia for medical treatments under false passports. Each claim fed the mystery, and with each passing year, the Don seemed less like a fugitive and more like an unsolvable puzzle. For his family, the silent years were equally complex. His children, raised in wealth and privilege, attempted to live lives of normalcy, yet the weight of their father's name followed them everywhere. Marriages, business ventures, and even social outings were scrutinized by the press. One daughter's marriage into a prominent cricketing family sparked headlines, while his son's alleged struggles with mental health added another layer of speculation. In every case, Dawood's shadow loomed, making it impossible for his family to escape the burden of his infamy. And yet, despite his silence, Dawood never faded entirely. Each time India suffered a terror attack or uncovered a major smuggling ring, his name reappeared. Politicians invoked him as the ultimate symbol of unpunished guilt, a reminder of both state failure and the resilience of crime. His ghost haunted diplomatic exchanges between India and Pakistan, where officials denied his presence even as intelligence dossiers piled up with photographs, maps, and alleged recordings. This period also saw a subtle transformation in how ordinary people perceived him. For older generations, Dawood remained a figure of fear and anger, the mastermind of the Bombay blasts who had escaped justice. For younger generations, however, he became almost mythical, a story told at night like a cautionary tale. His invisibility fed the idea that he was untouchable, perhaps even immortal. Some spoke of him with awe, others with disdain, but rarely with indifference. The irony of these silent years was that they did not diminish his presence but amplified it. Like a ghost, Dawood was felt more strongly in absence than in presence. His silence became louder than his voice. The less he appeared, the more people speculated. The less he acted openly, the more his legend expanded. In a world where information spread rapidly, Dawood became the rare figure whose mystery grew because of what was not known. As the years slipped into decades, one truth became clear: Dawood Ibrahim had mastered the art of vanishing without disappearing. He remained alive in whispers, headlines, films, and intelligence reports, even as his physical existence receded into uncertainty. In silence, he found power. In absence, he found presence. The boy from Dongri who once commanded the streets of Mumbai had now become something far stranger, a mythic ghost Don, hidden in plain sight, forever haunting the imaginations of those who longed for his downfall or marveled at his survival. By the mid-2000s, Dawood Ibrahim was no longer just India's most wanted criminal, he was now a global fugitive, the subject of an international manhunt that spanned continents. For decades, his reach had spread across borders, his network stretching from the alleyways of Dongri to the skyscrapers of Dubai, from betting dens in Mumbai to narcotics routes that snaked their way into Europe and Africa. But after the 1993 Bombay blasts and his increasing alignment with militant organizations, Dawood's name moved out of the realm of underworld folklore and into the lists of the world's most dangerous terrorists. What followed was a relentless chase, sometimes visible in newspaper headlines, sometimes invisible in the silent corridors of intelligence agencies, that sought to corner the ghost Don. The hunt truly intensified in 2003, when the United States Treasury Department officially designated Dawood Ibrahim as a global terrorist under Executive Order 13224. His name was placed alongside those of figures like Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda leaders, signaling a dramatic shift in how the world perceived him. No longer was Dawood merely the mastermind of smuggling and extortion rackets, he was now accused of financing and aiding terror activities, particularly in South Asia. For India, this was validation of what they had long argued, that Dawood was sheltered and supported by Pakistan, with the tacit approval of powerful elements within its establishment. Interpol had long carried a red corner notice for Dawood, but the challenge was not the issuance of warrants, it was the execution. Dawood was said to live under layers of protection, shielded by both loyal bodyguards and the political cover of powerful allies. Reports suggested his Karachi residence in the upscale Clifton area was fortified like a military compound, with high walls, armed guards, and surveillance systems. For Indian agencies, infiltrating such a fortress was nearly impossible. Each attempt at locating him yielded conflicting intelligence. Sometimes he was reported in Pakistan, other times in Dubai, and occasionally, stories emerged of him slipping into Saudi Arabia for medical treatment or religious pilgrimages. What made the hunt more complex was Dawood's mastery of disguise and movement. Intelligence reports suggested he used multiple passports under false names, often traveling with elaborate security details arranged through diplomatic connections. There were rumors that he had undergone cosmetic surgery to alter his appearance, though none of these were ever verified. These stories added to his ghost-like aura, a man always just out of reach, always slipping through the cracks of international law. For India's intelligence community, every shred of information became precious. Officers of the Research and Analysis Wing, RAW, and the Intelligence Bureau, IB, chased leads in the Middle East, interrogated captured operatives of D Company, and monitored financial transactions across Dubai and Karachi. Occasionally, major breakthroughs seemed imminent. In 2005, a report surfaced claiming Dawood had been cornered in Pakistan, but the story quickly fizzled out. Similar rumors arose in subsequent years, but each time, the Don eluded capture. To the frustration of Indian authorities, Pakistan consistently denied his presence on its soil, even as global intelligence reports pointed in the opposite direction. The CIA and other Western intelligence agencies also became involved, particularly as the war on terror expanded after September 11. Dawood's alleged links to Lashkar-e-Taiba and al-Qaeda made him a person of interest far beyond South Asia. Financial investigators traced money flows believed to have originated from D Company into terror financing networks. Some of these investigations pointed to sophisticated hawala routes that laundered millions across borders, with Dawood's invisible hand guiding the flow. Each trail led to another layer of complexity, and the Don remained one step ahead. The Indian government, meanwhile, explored both diplomatic and covert options. Successive administrations raised the issue of Dawood's extradition in bilateral talks with Pakistan, but these efforts met a familiar wall of denial. At the United Nations, India pushed for his recognition as a global terrorist, and eventually succeeded, strengthening the legal framework for sanctions against his networks. Yet, as effective as these measures were on paper, their enforcement in Pakistan remained doubtful. Dawood continued to live, at least according to Indian intelligence, in comfort and relative security, beyond the reach of those who sought justice for the victims of his crimes. During these years, the idea of a covert operation to eliminate Dawood began to circulate. Inspired by Israel's Mossad and later by America's killing of Osama bin Laden, Indian media and security experts debated whether India should launch a similar strike. Stories of Operation Dawood appeared in newspapers and on television talk shows, fueling public imagination. Some accounts suggested that such plans had been drawn up and even partially executed, only to be called off due to geopolitical risks. For the Indian public, these discussions were both tantalizing and frustrating, a reminder of how close yet how far their most wanted criminal remained. In the underworld, the global manhunt altered the balance of power. Rival gangs in Mumbai recognized that direct association with Dawood could invite international scrutiny, and some began distancing themselves. Yet others capitalized on his mystique, claiming loyalty to him as a way to intimidate local rivals. Even when absent, Dawood's name was a weapon, both a shield and a sword, depending on who invoked it. His fugitive status paradoxically elevated his legend. The Don was not just a criminal, he had become a phantom symbol of defiance against the law. For intelligence officers, the pursuit of Dawood was not just about one man, it was about dismantling a network. Every attempt to strike at his empire, whether through asset freezes, arrests of associates, or disruption of smuggling routes, was an attempt to weaken his invisible presence. And yet, the network proved remarkably resilient. New lieutenants replaced the old, new routes were established when old ones were blocked, and money continued to flow through the arteries of global crime. It was like trying to catch smoke with bare hands. What made Dawood's case so unique was the combination of myth and reality. In practical terms, he was a fugitive shielded by geopolitics, his arrest too costly for those harboring him. But in symbolic terms, he was the embodiment of India's unfinished business, a ghost who mocked their institutions with each passing year of freedom. The global manhunt, though technically ongoing, became less about the expectation of capture and more about the constant reminder of his evasion. Each headline that invoked his name reinforced his status as the Don who defied not just a nation but the collective machinery of international law enforcement. By the late 2000s, as newer threats emerged on the global stage, Dawood's priority on international lists may have shifted, but for India, the hunt never ceased. Politicians invoked him during election campaigns, promising justice that never arrived. Police officers in Mumbai still swore to bring him back in chains, though few truly believed it was possible. And in the shadows, Dawood continued to live, untouched and unseen, his ghostly figure slipping through the cracks of every net cast around him. The global manhunt for Dawood Ibrahim remains one of the most enduring sagas of modern crime. Unlike other notorious fugitives who were eventually cornered, Dawood's story is one of perpetual escape. Each intelligence lead, each diplomatic push, each covert plan added another layer to his legend. And as the years stretched on, the Don transformed into something larger than a criminal or even a terrorist. He became the ultimate phantom of the underworld, a man chased by the world's most powerful agencies, yet never caught, never silenced, always just beyond reach. The cracks in Dawood Ibrahim's empire began to show slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, like hairline fractures in a wall that had stood tall for decades. For years, his organization, D Company, had seemed invincible, a fortress of money, influence, and fear that extended from the bylanes of Mumbai to the gold souks of Dubai and the guarded enclaves of Karachi. But empires built on fear rarely last forever. Trust erodes, loyalties shift, and betrayals, sometimes from within, sometimes from the outside world, become inevitable. As the 2010s unfolded, it became clear that Dawood's reign was no longer what it once had been. The first major weakness came from within his own ranks. The same men who had once sworn eternal loyalty to the Don began to reconsider their positions as years passed and fortunes changed. Many had grown tired of living in his shadow, carrying out his orders while watching their own opportunities shrink. Arrests and targeted operations by Indian and international agencies thinned his inner circle. Lieutenants were picked off one by one, either captured, killed in encounters, or forced into hiding. Without the muscle of loyal commanders, the machinery of D Company began to sputter. Perhaps most damaging of all was the slow but steady defection of allies who had once built their own power on Dawood's patronage. The underworld thrives on shifting loyalties, and as Dawood's visible power weakened, other gangsters saw openings to rise. Kota Rajan, once his close lieutenant and later his bitter rival, had already split away in the 1990s, but by the 2000s, his camp actively fed intelligence to Indian agencies. Rajan's men became valuable informants, passing along whispers of D Company's operations, locations of safe houses, and identities of middlemen. This was betrayal not only in practical terms but in symbolic ones. The family-like loyalty Dawood once demanded was unraveling. Law enforcement too had grown wiser. In the past, Dawood's financial empire had thrived in part because of weak enforcement and loopholes in hawala systems. But as global counter-terrorism financing initiatives gained momentum, agencies worldwide tightened the screws on money laundering networks. Indian intelligence collaborated with international banks and agencies to monitor suspicious financial flows, often tracing them back to businesses linked to D Company. While Dawood himself remained untouchable, his syndicate began losing access to clean channels of money. Properties in Dubai and other Gulf nations, once safe investments, came under scrutiny. Some assets were frozen, others seized, forcing his lieutenants to scramble for new avenues. Inside India, the once-iron grip of D Company on Mumbai's underworld began to loosen. Local gangsters who had once feared Dawood's shadow now grew bolder, sensing that his direct influence had waned. Police encounters eliminated many of his ground-level operatives, while younger gangs, less tied to him, more concerned with local extortion, rose in prominence. Where once the mention of Dawood's name silenced conversations, now people spoke more freely, dismissing him as a relic of another era. For someone who thrived on fear, this shift was devastating. Another blow came through family. Dawood's relatives, who had once been the face of his softer side, became sources of controversy and gossip that eroded his aura. His younger brother Anis remained deeply involved in the business, but others drifted away. Some family members sought to distance themselves from the stigma of his name, attempting to live quieter lives. Others inadvertently brought more heat through public scandals. Marriages into high-profile families sparked media attention, and rumors about disputes among Dawood's children and siblings hinted at internal cracks. Even within the fortress, not everyone was loyal, and personal ambitions clashed with the larger empire's needs. The arrests of key associates during these years further exposed vulnerabilities. In 2015, Kota Rajan was captured in Indonesia and extradited to India, where he openly confirmed Dawood's continued presence in Pakistan. While Rajan was a rival, his testimony gave Indian agencies new ammunition. Other arrests, of bookies tied to cricket betting, drug mules caught in international busts, and mid-level operatives in Dubai, stripped away the layers of invisibility Dawood once enjoyed. Each man arrested was a thread that investigators pulled, unraveling more of D Company's global web. Perhaps most damning, though, was the realization that Dawood's empire was no longer feared in the same way. Stories began to circulate of associates cheating him, pocketing larger cuts of money, or using his name without sending dues back to Karachi. In the old days, such betrayals would have been punished with brutal swiftness. But now, Dawood's reach seemed dulled. Retaliations were fewer, enforcement weaker. Like an aging monarch whose generals no longer obeyed without question, Dawood's control was slipping into myth rather than reality. The geopolitical climate too shifted against him. For years, Pakistan had sheltered him, denying his presence while allegedly ensuring his safety. But under international pressure, especially as terror financing became a global issue, this protection became more delicate. Though Pakistan never officially acknowledged him, whispers suggested that even within its establishment, Dawood was no longer seen as an asset but as a liability, an aging fugitive whose usefulness had diminished. Some rumors hinted at restrictions placed on his movements, tighter monitoring of his activities, even periods of house arrest. Whether true or not, the narrative of a once powerful Don being curtailed by his own protectors only deepened the sense of decline. And yet, even in decline, Dawood's legend persisted. Media continued to chase his story, and Bollywood continued to draw inspiration from his life. But the portrayals changed. Where once films depicted him as a larger-than-life kingpin, newer narratives showed him as a fading figure, haunted by paranoia and isolation. The myth of invincibility cracked, replaced by the image of a man trapped in his own exile, betrayed by friends, weakened by time, and hunted by forces far larger than himself. This decline had ripple effects on the psychology of those who once revered him. For decades, Dawood had been a symbol of defiance, proof that one could rise from the alleys of Dongri to command empires that crossed oceans. But as his grip loosened, he became a cautionary tale instead. His silence, once interpreted as strategic brilliance, now looked like fear. His invisibility, once a weapon, began to feel like confinement. Slowly, the cracks in the empire revealed the truth: Dawood Ibrahim was not untouchable after all. The fall of such a figure is rarely sudden. It happens in whispers, in betrayals, in the arrests of those who carry your messages and money. It happens when rivals speak more loudly than your loyalists, when your name evokes less fear and more doubt. Dawood's empire did not collapse overnight, it eroded piece by piece, leaving behind an aging Don surrounded by shadows, haunted by the knowledge that the power he once held so tightly was slipping forever beyond his grasp. Legends have a way of surviving longer than the men who inspire them, and in Dawood Ibrahim's case, the legend has long overshadowed the certainty of fact. By the time the 2010s matured into the 2020s, his story had entered the realm of ghostly whispers, a tale told in half-truths, conspiracy theories, and fleeting sightings. Newspapers occasionally ran front-page headlines declaring that Dawood had been seen in a hospital in Karachi, or that he had slipped away to Dubai under a false passport, or that he had been spotted performing the Hajj in Mecca. Each time, the story stirred the public imagination, only to fade back into uncertainty, like smoke dissolving into the air. The ghost Don lived on not only in his physical absence but also in the minds of millions who wondered, where is Dawood Ibrahim now? One of the most persistent rumors placed him in Karachi's affluent Clifton neighborhood. Journalists and intelligence dossiers often spoke of a heavily guarded bungalow near the sea, surrounded by security men and high walls, a prison as much as a sanctuary. Some accounts claimed he led a quiet, reclusive life there, rarely stepping outside, praying regularly, and spending most of his time with immediate family. Others painted a more opulent picture, suggesting he still entertained select guests, held private gatherings, and indulged in luxuries far removed from his modest beginnings in Dongri. The truth, as always, lay somewhere between. But Clifton was only one of many alleged hideouts. Over the years, whispers circulated of Dawood traveling secretly under assumed names. Some claimed he frequented Dubai, his old playground, where he supposedly received medical treatment and attended private weddings under high security. Others spoke of him slipping into Saudi Arabia for religious pilgrimages, blending into the millions of faithful who thronged Mecca and Medina each year. There were even stories that he had traveled as far as Africa, using business links in Kenya, Tanzania, and South Africa to mask his movements. Each rumor carried its own logic, and each was impossible to verify, keeping the myth alive. His supposed appearances often fueled public fascination. Taxi drivers in Dubai swore they had once ferried a mysterious passenger with striking resemblance to the Don, while hoteliers claimed to have hosted special guests with unusual security arrangements. In Karachi, whispers passed from chai stalls to markets of a convoy speeding through the city late at night, believed to carry the elusive fugitive. These accounts, unverifiable yet vivid, turned Dawood into a phantom figure, everywhere and nowhere at once. His health became another subject of endless speculation. Reports surfaced every few years of Dawood suffering from severe illness, kidney failure, gangrene, cancer, or even paralysis. Some news channels confidently declared his imminent death, only for the claims to be dismissed days later by security agencies or contradicted by new sightings. For the public, these health rumors were both tantalizing and frustrating, tantalizing because they suggested the natural end of a man who had long eluded justice, and frustrating because the rumors never seemed to resolve into truth. The idea that Dawood could die quietly in exile, far from the courts and jails of India, only added to the anger of those who sought closure for his crimes. The uncertainty around his fate also created fertile ground for conspiracy theories. Some believed Dawood had secretly cut deals with powerful governments, buying protection in exchange for intelligence on other criminal and militant groups. Others insisted he had faked his own death and was living under a new identity somewhere in the Middle East. A few even suggested he had quietly returned to India, hidden under a false name, living a life of secrecy in the very city he once ruled. The plausibility of these stories mattered less than the fascination they inspired. In the absence of proof, imagination filled the void. Bollywood, of course, played its part in keeping his ghost alive. Films continued to borrow his persona, disguising him under fictional names while clearly drawing from his life. Some portrayed him as a fading kingpin haunted by betrayal, others as a cunning mastermind still pulling strings from afar. Each film blurred fact and fiction further, ensuring that for the younger generation, Dawood Ibrahim was less a man and more a character, a cinematic archetype of the untouchable Don. For intelligence agencies, the rumors were both a curse and a tool. Every reported sighting had to be investigated, draining resources and time. Yet these rumors also kept pressure alive, ensuring Dawood's name never disappeared from the global wanted lists. Satellite images were studied, phone calls intercepted, financial trails followed, but each lead seemed to end in a fog. Sometimes, agencies used the uncertainty to their advantage, planting their own stories in the media to flush out information or rattle Dawood's associates. The game of shadows continued, a dance of rumor and counter-rumor, where the truth was elusive by design. Meanwhile, for ordinary people in Mumbai, Dawood's ghost lingered in a more personal way. His name was still whispered in the city's underbelly, invoked by small-time extortionists and gangsters as a symbol of power. Property disputes, betting scandals, and narcotic seizures often carried faint traces of D Company, whether real or imagined. For many, it didn't matter whether Dawood himself had ordered anything, the idea of him was enough. Like a phantom crime boss, his legend haunted the streets even in his absence. There was also the question of legacy. Would Dawood's children, scattered across different countries, carry forward his empire? Some reports suggested they had little appetite for the criminal life, choosing instead to live quietly, married into influential families or pursuing business interests far removed from the underworld. Others whispered that his brother Anis and a few loyal lieutenants continued to oversee the remnants of D Company, though on a smaller scale. This ambiguity reinforced the idea of a ghostly empire, present but fading, visible only in fragments, never whole. The paradox of Dawood Ibrahim in these years was stark: the less he was seen, the more he was believed to be everywhere. Every rumor added another layer to his myth. Every alleged sighting gave birth to new stories. The uncertainty of his whereabouts became his greatest weapon, keeping him alive in the imagination of both allies and enemies. Like a ghost, he was felt more than he was seen, haunting headlines, conversations, and memories. And so, Dawood Ibrahim transformed fully into the ghost Don. A man who once ruled with visible fear now ruled invisibly through myth. A man who once walked the streets of Mumbai now walked only through rumors. Whether alive, ill, or long gone, his story refused to die. He became less of a fugitive and more of a legend, a presence that haunted the living world while existing in the twilight space between fact and fable. Legends often outlive the men who inspire them, and in Dawood Ibrahim's case, the legend has become inseparable from the shadow he cast over Mumbai, India, and the wider world. As we reach the final reflections on his life and legacy, it is important to pause and recognize the paradox that defines him. On the one hand, he is remembered as a ruthless Don, the mastermind of the 1993 Bombay blasts, the architect of criminal empires stretching across continents. On the other, he is remembered as a ghostly figure, unseen, unheard, and yet omnipresent, whose very absence made him larger than life. His story is not just one of crime, but also of myth, fear, fascination, and the enduring question: how does one man become an eternal shadow? For Mumbai, Dawood's legacy is deeply personal. To this day, his name conjures images of narrow lanes in Domri where boys dreamed of power, of cricket betting scandals that shook the nation, of glittering Bollywood parties where underworld money mingled with stardust. His empire left scars on the city, families ruined by extortion, neighborhoods shattered by bombs, and generations that grew up believing the police could never truly touch the powerful. For ordinary Mumbaikars, Dawood remains a symbol of both trauma and myth, a reminder of the fragile boundary between the lawful and the lawless. But Dawood's legacy also extends beyond crime. He became a mirror for India's anxieties and aspirations. For politicians, invoking his name was a way to rally voters, a shorthand for unfinished justice. For the police, his elusiveness was a constant reminder of their limitations. For filmmakers, he was an endless source of inspiration, embodying the archetypal gangster, stylish, cunning, feared, yet strangely charismatic. In this way, Dawood was no longer just a man, he became a narrative device, a figure whose life explained the darker sides of urban ambition. The ghostly quality of his legacy lies in the contradictions. Dawood Ibrahim is remembered as both powerful and powerless, feared and mocked, everywhere and nowhere. He ruled an empire yet lived in exile. He inspired loyalty yet suffered betrayals. He commanded respect yet was reduced to rumors of illness and confinement. This tension is what keeps his story alive, because it is unfinished. A fugitive who dies unpunished leaves behind a wound that never fully heals. In the broader context of global crime, Dawood represents the transition of underworld figures from local thugs to transnational kingpins. His networks demonstrated how crime could no longer be confined to one city or one country. Smuggling routes, hawala operations, narcotics pipelines, all operated across borders, making him as much a global player as a local don. His designation as a global terrorist marked him not just as India's enemy, but as part of the international underworld that thrives in the shadows of geopolitics. His story serves as a case study in how organized crime adapts, evolves, and survives even under immense pressure. Yet what sets Dawood apart from others is the myth that outgrew the man. While figures like Al Capone or Pablo Escobar eventually met their ends, Dawood remained suspended in mystery. His silence has become louder than any statement he could make. His absence from public life has paradoxically made him omnipresent in the imagination. He is the ghost don precisely because his story has no clear ending, no courtroom trial, no confirmed death, no captured image of downfall. Instead, he lives in the liminal space between fact and fable, an eternal fugitive in history's memory. For India, Dawood's legacy is one of frustration as much as fascination. The inability to bring him to justice remains a sore point, a reminder of diplomatic stalemates and geopolitical realities. Each time his name resurfaces, whether in intelligence reports, media rumors, or Bollywood scripts, it rekindles the unresolved tension between desire for justice and the reality of evasion. His legend thrives because it embodies both national anger and national helplessness. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of Dawood's legacy is what it says about power itself. Power, in his story, is not just about money, guns, or fear, it is about narrative. Dawood controlled his image carefully, cultivating both terror and mystique. He was never photographed recklessly, never gave interviews, never allowed his voice to be common. Even in exile, he maintained relevance by being elusive. The less people knew, the more they speculated. And speculation, over time, became myth. In this sense, Dawood understood something fundamental: legends are born not from visibility but from mystery. As we reflect on his journey, from a boy in Dongri to a global fugitive, the arc is both cautionary and compelling. It is a cautionary tale of ambition unchecked, of how crime may offer quick power but ultimately leads to isolation, paranoia, and exile. It is also a compelling reminder of how human beings are drawn to stories of defiance, of those who challenge authority and seem to escape its grip. Dawood embodied both, the criminal mastermind whose crimes left indelible scars, and the ghostly figure whose evasion inspired fascination. What remains, then, is the question of his ultimate fate. Will Dawood Ibrahim die quietly in a guarded bungalow, his story unresolved? Will he be captured and brought to India, closing a chapter that has remained open for decades? Or will he fade further into myth, remembered only as a name whispered in connection to crimes past? Each possibility carries its own weight, and until one becomes reality, his shadow will linger. In the end, Dawood's greatest legacy is not the empire he built or the crimes he committed, it is the myth he became. Like a ghost, he is felt more than seen, remembered more than known. His story reminds us that power is fleeting, but myths endure. His empire may have cracked, his health may have faltered, his allies may have betrayed him, but the legend of Dawood Ibrahim continues to haunt the imagination of millions. And so, the ghost Don remains. Not in the bustling lanes of Domri, not in the glittering towers of Dubai, not even in the guarded compounds of Karachi. He remains in memory, in myth, in the uneasy twilight between fact and fable. His shadow stretches beyond borders and beyond time, a reminder that some stories are never fully resolved. As long as his name is whispered, Dawood Ibrahim will remain what he always aspired to be, more than a man, less than a god, forever a ghost haunting the underworld's darkest corridors.